Okay, hello everybody. Thanks for tuning in to today's broadcast of what would have been week four's class session, which obviously got off to a late start. And again, we had some networking problems really throughout the main campus. So I think I communicated to you in the announcements, so I apologize for that. It was unexpected, and we had a number of people trying to help the situation. I think we finally got it resolved. It was a little bit late in the class session, and I realized that a lot of people were not there. So also we tried to save it, and we actually used one of our IT people's login ID. It's some sort of special way to get out, but we didn't end up saving the recording. So we lost that. So I'm just going to redo that portion that I talked about on Thursday, last Thursday, and then go forward and talk a little bit about what we're going to be, hopefully if I'm able to go forward here, if security doesn't kick me out of the building here the day before Thanksgiving. I'll get into the content that I would have talked about for Thursday's class session. That would have, Thursday week 5, that would have fallen on Thanksgiving. So I thought it better. Some instructors are recording videos ahead of time, some after the fact. And so if I don't get through all of it today, I'll probably come in probably Monday and wrap that up as a separate video. But let's go ahead and pick up from where we left off at the end of class session 3, where we were talking about GDP. And we talked about the fact that when we talked about national income, and by the way, national income is found online through something called the BEA, bea.gov will be the website to go to, and you can get all the information about, in fact, more information than what you probably ever thought you would want to see on GDP there in bea.gov. And I'm going to send you a couple of links that will sort of break these out. This, the expenditures approach, and then the second approach is the income approach, which I just talked a bit about at the end of class session 3. But I wanted to talk about the expenditures approach. I wanted to link it back to the circular flow model that we've been using before. And again, as I mentioned at the very outset when we first started talking about the circular flow model, there are literally millions of different examples of the circular flow model, and where you can have households up here and firms out here and whatever. So it doesn't really make any difference as long as the relationships are the same. What I've chosen to do here with the markers is to have the red physical flow, what we call the physical flow, or the so-called real economy, denoted here. And so I've got the basic exchange of firms providing goods to households, households providing goods to firms in the form of labor, firms buying goods from other goods, then exports. And by the way, this term X sub N is basically just the difference between exports, which we call X, and imports, which we call M. And we're going to be using M again for something else a bit later very soon. So it depends upon the context in which we use these algebraic symbols, X minus M. And so exports, these are goods flowing out, and imports are goods flowing in. And then we'll talk about what the payment flows are here right now. So when we talk about the expenditures approach, we're talking about the demand side of the economy. Who's doing the buying for these goods? And so as we've said before, that when we talk about GDP, which is also simply known as the capital letter Y, this is a dollar figure. Okay, these are all dollar figures, every one of these. So if we're trying to measure the output of the economy, all of these are measured in dollars, obviously. And if you were talking about a different economy like the Mexican economy, it'd be pesos, and the German economy would be rubles, et cetera. You get the idea. It's denominated in monetary terms, and we'll talk a bit about money as we get into the content from chapter 5, what it is, how we define it, et cetera. So these are all dollar flows. And so when we talk about households, governments, and firms, what we're really talking about is we can take these 3 actor groups and link them back to where they sort of fit in with regard to the circular flow model. Households provide consumption spending, and government provides government spending, obviously, and firms provide investment spending. And this will be noted here through, and I kind of left myself not very much room here. So let me, we talk about goods being exchanged. We know that goods are exchanged for spending, which is simply consumer spending. So the green arrow here is the dollar figure, that's consumer spending in exchange for goods. Households buy goods, and they're produced by firms. Also, households don't provide labor for free. They expect to be compensated in the form of wages, which is a dollar flow, okay? And then firms buy goods from other goods, and we simply refer to these goods that firms are buying from other goods as capital goods. we've defined this before as long-lived goods. That is, with a purpose that only applies really to businesses, things like 18-wheelers and printing presses and conveyor belts, things of that nature. And this term of this spending, we simply refer to as investment. So that's investment spending, or I. So C plus I, right? Let's call this C here. C for consumer spending, I for investment. And then government does buy goods from business firms, and so their goods do flow to government. And also, people do provide labor to government. And so as a result of this, we have government spending, which we're going to cover a lot more in chapter 13, the idea of G, or government spending. So G, or government spending. Whether it's buying goods, making, constructing things, paying wages, whatever, it's all government spending, including things like unemployment benefits and whatnot, which we simply refer to as transfer payments. And I'll talk a bit more about transfers here in just a second, because it's one of the areas where there is no reciprocal flow here. Now, I know this gets busy, and in fact, there's a circular flow model in your book in chapter 7, which it sort of expands, probably easier to see because it's a little bit, it's in typewritten in nice blocks and all that, but it's even more busy, that involves, other, elements of spending, gets a little bit more detail with regard to government, whatnot, state and local, et cetera. If we just took this right here and just said, okay, we're done, and everything within the self-contained little island, this little Gilligan's Island here, is all that's happening. Nothing comes in, nothing leaves, no goods come in, no goods leave, no labor comes in, no labor leaves. We would call that a closed economy. And a closed economy is one that's, as the name implies, it's not open to anything coming in or anything leaving. So in other words, it's like, the Gilligan's Island scenario, where nobody comes in, nobody leaves. It's a self-contained economy. Now, those are very few today. In fact, I can't think of too many, other than maybe North Korea. Too many big economies. I mean, North Korea kind of comes to mind as being sort of an isolated place, but even they import things like energy and food and whatnot. I guess the only real examples are extremely isolated areas of the world, particularly island places, because they're not often difficult to get to. And I know that some of those were discovered after the tsunami in 2004, 2005, when aid workers tried to get at some of these places to see whether people were okay. In the wake of the tsunami, people there had never seen other people before. And you would think in this day and age, in this century, you wouldn't have that happen, but these were very, very, very isolated areas. So really, closed economies really don't exist, except it's the degree of openness or closedness, I guess is what you could say about it. So it's a question of degree. So in other words, we have an open economy pretty much everywhere. And when exports come in, when exports go out, the goods export payments come in, and those are a dollar figure. And when imports come in from abroad, then import payments go out. As a result, we have the idea of dollars coming in, dollars leaving. Dollars coming in when there are goods being exported. Obviously, that's the exchange of the goods and money. Goods coming in, and import payments, or money going out. And so when we have a condition in which, and I think I went over this last time, when exports are greater than imports, then we end up, and it's all countries taken together. It's not just the US versus Canada and US versus the United Kingdom or whatever. It's all goods taken together. And so when exports are greater than imports, it means more money is flowing in than is flowing out. So it's called a trade surplus, which has a positive effect on GDP. Okay, so it has a positive effect on GDP. GDP tends to go up. And I'll just put a little arrow, brings GDP up. When exports are less than imports, we call it a trade deficit. It has a drag on GDP. And the reason for this is very simple. It's because of the fact that the US, if we're talking about the US, and usually that's really the orientation that we want to go here, is we're talking about the US economy. The US is financing more of the world's output and income than the rest of the world is financing our output and income. Now we have surpluses with certain countries, and by the way, we have a surplus with the rest of the world in services, things like legal services, healthcare services, entertainment products, services being that non-inventoriable, non-physical good, because whatever physical nature there is of the good is mostly irrelevant. The U.S. has a surplus with the rest of the world, but has a big, big deficit when it comes to goods, physical goods. And a lot of that is minerals, natural resources like oil. And oil has been the culprit for a very long time in terms of contributing to that. Has been as much as a third of the trade deficit over time, which has had a drag on GDP. And we could do an entire semester on energy economics, but just suffice to say that is one of the contributors. And so here all I'm trying to do is sort of link these together and talk about the fact that we've got C, and we've got I, and we've got G, and we've got X minus N. And so they're all sort of accounted for within that, okay? And then the second of these, I'm not going to go through the entire list because, in fact, the list I gave you the last class session when we talked about the income approach was actually quite abbreviated in its own right, and I'm going to even abbreviate even further here. We talked about the income approach, where we started out with gross national product, and we came down to gross domestic product and national income. And we had, national income, and we, obviously I'm cutting pieces out of this. Then we arrive at personal income. And personal income is simply defined as the portion of GDP that flows as income to households. Because at the national income level, we've basically accounted for corporate income. And by the way, government is in there collecting its piece of the action through income taxes. And pretty much every turn here, we say that a lot of transactions are taxed and lots of incomes are taxed. And so government, both at federal and state and local levels, are picking up their taxes as we go. And so we work our way down to personal income, and that's the portion of GDP that goes to household pre-tax. Also, keep in mind that we talked about the expenditures approach as being the demand side of the economy. That is who's doing the spending. Well, the income approach is the supply side of the economy, who's doing the supplying of the goods. In this case, labor is a good. Now, it's a market for an input, not an output. You go to work and you provide your input, but it is nonetheless a supply. And so as a result, you've got labor being supplied and wages being compensated for it. So the personal income figure is a figure that applies to households pre-tax. And if you take out, if you just start with personal income, then take out personal income taxes. And I'm going to come back to this when we get into chapter 10 and talking about some of the basics of modeling, economic modeling, which we'll be doing here shortly. And we arrive at disposable income. And disposable income is simply the after-tax portion of disposable income. So it's, in other words, the after-tax portion of GDP that goes to households. And with that, there are only two things that can be done with it, and that's spending it or saving it. I think this is where we sort of left off last time toward the very end, was this idea of what to do, what does a household do with its income, spends it or saves it, okay? And that'll be an important part of how we build the first economic model that we'll be building, and not just this sort of graphic model here, okay? One thing I did want to talk about was transfers, just real briefly here, because one of the things about transfers is that we have personal income, okay, and disposable income that consists not just of wages and interest income and rental income and maybe a business income that somebody has, but also it can include things like Social Security, unemployment benefits. It could be things like food assistance. All these things are what we call transfers. And transfer payments are payments usually from government to households, although there are business transfers where government pays businesses to do certain things. That's going to be beyond what we want to do here. So I just want to focus on transfers to households. Things like Medicare, Medicaid, those kinds of support payments, even though those are direct to households, they are for the household's benefit. Social Security directly is a direct payment, as is unemployment benefits and whatnot. What do we need to know about transfers in this context? We need to know that it's not compensated for by some action. You don't have to do anything to get it other than to be eligible. And I know that when I say you don't have to do anything, well, I know, yes, you have to go through some steps to apply and, you know, provide whatever information is required. I know unemployment benefits, you have to check in once a week. Unemployment is administered through states. It's a federal program. It's funded through a tax on businesses called the federal unemployment tax, but it's administered by states, as is Medicaid. And you have to, in order to get, like for unemployment, for instance, you have to check in once a week. Now you can do it online and just simply, you know, say, hey, yes, I'm still employed. No, I haven't been working, whatever. You don't have to actually work or not to go do anything. You just have to be eligible and to meet the requirements, which are somewhat minimal, I think. Okay. As for Social Security, I know that that's a sort of a controversial thing to say you don't have to do anything to get it. I'm talking about the retirement benefits, something we will call OASI, Old Age Survivors Insurance. Not a term we would probably use today. It's a little bit outdated, but yes, you had to pay taxes throughout your entire working life in order to get those benefits. So yes, you did have to pay into it. But the fact of the matter is there's still no quid pro quo necessarily, because if you work until age 50 and then you happen to pass away, having no spouse or dependents, all those taxes you paid simply don't go anywhere. They're retained by the government. You never get the benefit of that. So there is no reciprocity. It's not like a pension program or a retirement account, like a 401k. Okay. All right. So real briefly, I know your slide package, we talked a bit about what are some of the shortcomings with GDP. I wanted to kind of briefly cover what some of these are, so that you can kind of, just sort of review those. But number one, it doesn't account for a number of things. And I know we had a discussion activity talking about, hey, what's not accounted for? And a lot of you did a real good job of talking about the fact that things that affect a quality of life are not included. And that was really the thrust of the discussion, was what about quality of life? And what are we not getting here? And some of those are things like environmental destruction or environmental protection, whichever the case might be, is not accounted for. We don't do a very good job of accounting for the effect on the environment. We do a much better job in microeconomics, and we have ways of measuring those sorts of outcomes. But from a macro perspective, it's really difficult to say, are we better off with all this output and income if in fact we're creating lots of pollution, which might not even be harmful right away. It may take quite a long time for it to work its way through the system and start impacting people. I know the hometown where I grew up is now the water system is badly poisoned. But it was because of a fiberglass plant that was dumping waste into the groundwater, and it took quite a long time before it became known. And now the water is completely contaminated, so nobody drinks the water. They all have bottled water, and they're going to have to for quite some time until nature corrects that problem. So that's one issue. It doesn't account for things like leisure and all that, but it doesn't account for uncounted production, which is one of the points that I made here. And that was the idea that if I do something for you, like, I fix the brakes on your car and whatnot, and, I just do it, for free, or maybe you make me that pie or whatever, I don't know if that's greatly a fair trade, but whatever, then there's no economic value being reported. Also household labor, which is sort of a growing area of interest, and that is the idea that what is the economic value of us watching our own children versus us taking kids to daycare and whatnot. Presumably it's roughly the same activity, but if I take my child to daycare, then there's an economic transaction being recorded, presumably tax being paid on that activity. And so therefore we're picking up that economic output and income. What we're not getting is if the value of us watching our kids ourselves. And of course, why would you? There is no transaction that gets created. But is there economic value? It's a good question. Also, if you do something around your house, you repair your own roof and you do all the labor yourself, but you buy the materials at Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever. The only part that goes into GDP is just the materials that you bought at the store at Lowe's or wherever. The labor is not accounted for because you're not presumably going to be paying yourself to do it. On the other hand, if you hired a contractor to do it, then that party would count it. Everything that goes to that contractor would be accounted for. So you get the idea of household production being a difficult one to account for in that regard. It also is an underground economic activity. I talked a little bit about the idea that there are certain things that are not accounted for. And one of the issues are things like barter activities. And that kind of goes a little bit more to the idea that I talked about. I do this for you and you do this for me. By the way, barter transactions by law should be recorded on your taxes. If you decide to repair your neighbor's brakes and he repairs your roof, then and you call an even trade, that should be recorded as income. That's what tax laws require. But it rarely isn't. And then a lot of times people don't know they're even supposed to do it. And I think that's a very innocent thing to get oneself caught up in. How did I, who knew, right? That type of thing. But we miss it, and because it's not recorded, we miss it. And so that sort of underground activity is missed. And when we say underground, we don't necessarily want to say people are up to no good. Obviously, illegal activities are all underground. And the narcotics trade we've talked about being unknowably large. I've heard so many different numbers about the size, the estimated size of the global narcotics trade, which is by definition underground. And it's all over the place. I don't know that is known. And now it's even more complicated because a lot of people are using Bitcoin and Ethereum and some of these other cryptocurrencies, which makes it even more difficult. And personally, I'm sort of waiting for the other shoe to drop on cryptocurrencies. I don't think it's going to end well. I can't imagine the governments are going to let cryptocurrencies exist forever, but I could be wrong on that. And in fact, it would be difficult to police, I think, because it's international, it's sort of underground, it's anonymous. We'll see. Another story for another day. Okay. All right. So that's another issue. What else on this? Doesn't account for the changing quality of goods. There have been efforts, and mostly futile efforts, to account for the quality of goods. That is, we're producing $20 trillion of output, but is that output getting better or is it getting worse? I think the good news there is that it's probably getting better. I think most people would agree that a television set today is a better television set than what our parents had. I think that's probably safe to say and an easy one to conclude. There are, however, goods that are made to wear out, and because of that, because they're made to be replaced. Things like razor blades and light bulbs, and goods are meant to wear out. And it's part of the whole picture, and it's meant to happen. So you could make a razor blade that will last longer. You can make a light bulb that would last longer. As I mentioned in the last class session, Edison's light bulb burned for over 100 years after he first invented it. So you get the idea that, but nobody would buy light bulbs if all you had to do is buy one once, or however many for your house, and that was it. So, okay. So quality of goods becomes difficult to measure. We do pretty well with quantity. Quality, different story. It's hard to really know. And in fact, when it comes to things like food, I think there's a lot of people arguing that we as Americans are eating less well than what we used to, particularly given all the processed foods and whatnot that we eat, a lot of fast foods, that maybe from that respect, we're not taking care of our health as well as we should. And I think a lot of us can speak for ourselves. I know I can in that regard. But I think and I think one bit of evidence for that whole line of thinking is the idea that we spend more than the rest of the world by far in healthcare, which ought to make us extremely healthy, but we're not. We're pretty far down the list in terms of healthy. It's a lot of it because of choices and whatnot. So quality of the output is an issue. Also, it doesn't talk about the small idea of standard of living. I mentioned that earlier. Also, per capita GDP is not accounted for. Whenever we talk about a per capita anything, okay, and per capita is simply is Latin for per head, meaning per person, but per capita GDP is simply GDP throughout the economy divided by the number of people in the population. And that's all it is. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we sort of modify GDP for price level changes. I'll get to that right here in just a second. But the idea is that if income were evenly distributed, then we could just simply look at per capita GDP and say, if it's higher this year than last year, that means we're all better off, if it's equally distributed. But I think we all know intuitively and just through our own experience that per capita GDP is not equivalently distributed. In fact, it's getting more unevenly distributed for lots and lots of reasons. And there are entire bodies of work going on as to why income is so maldistributed in our economy, more than probably most other industrial countries. A lot of it has to do with tax policy, compensation of people, that sort of thing. So plus we've got a lot of people who make a lot of money doing things that other societies don't value as much. You hear about some of these salaries for baseball players. It's just unbelievable. It's crazy. I mean, it kind of defies logic. You can almost think football players makes a little bit of sense because their careers are so brief. But these baseball players who have these extremely long contracts and pretty long careers, I mean, it's sort of unfathomable in a lot of ways. And by no means am I trying to criticize other people's salaries, but I'm simply saying, if we want to talk about where some of the maldistribution comes from, it comes from some of the real lopsided outcomes when it comes to personal income. Okay? All right, and then finally, we talk about this idea of changes for price levels over time. I want to talk a little about this idea of real versus nominal. Now, and there's a lot of discussion in your text about this, which begins really around chapter 8 and then gets into, and we'll be coming back to it again and again, including in chapter 12, when we talk about aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Whenever we talk about real versus nominal, anything, real GDP, real personal income, real interest rates, real savings, whatever, what we're talking about is we're taking out the effects of inflation. And so anything, whether it's real GDP, whatever, we're saying it's inflation adjusted. We're saying it's inflation adjusted. So in other words, we're taking away the distortion that happens to the value of things simply because of the fact that price levels change over time. And so we know that someone's salary in 1950 will be a heck of a lot less than it is today. It doesn't mean that they were that much less well off, even though there was less variety of goods and presumably less quality goods, it's safe to say, but not that much less. I mean, not like 1/20th or something like that, which is about what that factor would be. They're not that much worse off. Instead, you have to pump those numbers up to put inflation in the picture, and then you can compare it, okay? Because if you don't, all you're looking at here is nominal versus nominal, and that is not inflation adjusted. So if you're saying that the average salary today in the US, average household income in the US is around upper 40s, 48,000, something like that. Compare that to 1950, which was about 2,000, 2,500, something like that. Then, you know, obviously $2,500 as an income today would not be enough to survive without some sort of support, I don't think, at least, unless you had very, very minimal means of subsistence. So you'd have to pump that up in order to account for inflation. And I'll talk a bit more about inflation here very shortly, including discussing how we define inflation, what the actual definitional parameters are of just what inflation is. Okay. All right. So when we talk about inflation, first of all, because I just want to wrap this up when we talk about GDP, I want to talk about this idea of how we account for inflation over time. And we do it through the use of a price index or a PI, and we arrive at some sort of index value. So price index is simply something which tracks the value of something over time. Everywhere in economics, whenever you see the term index, you're talking about something that's being tracked usually over a fairly long period of time, what we would call a longitudinal analysis that's taking it over time. And so the price index is simply what we refer to as an index value, usually beginning at around 100. And the reason for that is maybe going to become obvious here in just a second. So if you take, for instance, a price index, in order to make it sort of meaningful from one year to the next, you would take the price index for whatever year, say year X, and divide that by the price index value in some base year, whatever that base year is. Let's just say it's the year 2000, right? We were using the year 2000 for some time, and then I think we periodically adjusted. 2009, I think, is still being used. In fact, it might even be 2009, but let's just go with 2000. And then we arrive at some sort of value. And so as a result, if you've got something like this going on, or you've got, and then we multiply it by 100 for reasons that I'll talk about here in just a second. So if it's 104 divided by the base year, which is set to 100, then, and we end up with 1.04 times 100, and we end up back at 104. Now, you might think, well, all we did is end up back at the same place because we divided by 100 and multiplied by 100. That's true, but what about over time but it gives us also an easy thing to look at and gives us a quick and dirty measure of the change in the price level over very long time periods. What if it's 235? And that means the price has gone up by 2 1/3 times between whatever the year we're talking about here is and some base year. So it's an easy comparison. And if you're multiplying it by 100, all you're doing is you're getting rid of the decimal. That's all you're doing there. And we'll see something similar when it comes to talking about the unemployment rate and whatnot. So that's what price index is about. Anyway, much more on price indexes as we get into that discussion of the text, when we talk much more about inflation and what that's about. For right now, the thing to know about is the idea that we do account for GDP in terms of both real and nominal. Real and nominal both are important to talk about. So let me go ahead and erase all of this, and then I want to jump into talking a bit about some of the content from chapter 8. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to let me try to mark where I've stopped here, just in case somebody wants a reference. These are going to be some fairly long videos. I realize you're probably going to want to get up and walk around a little bit. I'm trying to find the time thing here. Shoot. Well, I guess I'm not able to find it. Well, never mind. I was going to try to put the time on there where we are leaving off and moving on to different topics. I guess I'm not going to be able to do that. So anyway, bear with me. I apologize for that. Let's get into some of the content in chapter 8. It's an interesting chapter. It's a little bit, there's some math involved, but it's not anything too drastic, I don't think. And it talks about really two main things, and it's unemployment and it's inflation, okay? Unemployment and inflation. One of the points that we're going to make here in this class, in this introductory macro class, is the idea that when we talk about economic problems in economics, in macroeconomics, the two biggest are unemployment on the one hand and inflation on the other, even though they might find themselves at different parts of the business cycle. And so if you go back to what we talked about, and I realized that chapter 6 was a pretty light chapter. Hopefully nobody found it too difficult. I didn't commit people to reading a whole lot from that. The big thing we want to take away from it was this idea of business cycles. That is the idea that GDP goes up and it goes down, it goes up and it goes down. And so one of the things that we talked about earlier was this sort of downslope, which we call a recession. And one of the things that recessions are characterized by is rising unemployment. This is probably pretty obvious, rising unemployment during a recession. And during an expansion, we see a falling unemployment. Nothing too complicated about that, falling unemployment during a period of an expansion. And then at the top of a business cycle, if a business cycle gets a little bit too heated for itself, it could be inflation. And I'm going to put a little question mark by it because it's not always necessarily the top of a business cycle where we have inflation. Right now, we've got a fairly complicated picture going on with regard to inflation. So much so, there's a lot of debate among economists as to what this inflation that we've been seeing for the last several months, and it's not been going on for a greatly long period of time, but what it's all about. I know I've talked about this in prior class sessions, the idea that inflation, which was something we didn't really talk very much about for quite some time, only maybe sort of an academic exercise within classes, but now it's a real life thing where we're all seeing higher prices. Some of it's due to scarcity of goods. That's a lot of it. In fact, that's the hope right now among a lot of policymakers, is that some of this is temporary, and that once we get the supply chains worked out, the kinks in the supply chain, once we get everybody back to work, in other words, once this pandemic and all its effects are mitigated, then we'll see prices come down as more goods flood the market. Sellers will have to compete a little harder for those goods, and we won't see quite as much spike in the price level. We'll see. I'm a little skeptical of that, but we will see. It's my hope. I hope that's correct, but we don't know. But we'll come back to inflation in a minute. Let's talk a bit about unemployment for a minute. We'll talk about what unemployment is. And the thing about unemployment is this. From an economic standpoint, we can say unemployment is an underutilization of inputs. And that's a very wonky way of putting it, an underutilization of inputs. Because remember, we talked about input factors earlier in the class. We said that input factors include things like, land, labor, capital goods, like machinery and equipment. And even though we think about unemployment as being an unemployment of labor, which makes sense, we also have to keep in mind it's also unemployment of other inputs, like materials and labor, or like materials and capital goods and facilities and whatnot that aren't being used. In other words, they're being underutilized, and so as a result, that's also an element of unemployment as well. So unemployment is not just people, but we are going to talk and focus on the unemployment of people primarily because it does impact a lot of us. And then we will talk about the fact that even if it doesn't impact us directly, we're going to make the case for why unemployment is a problem. And it'll be presented hopefully with the idea of trying to be clear about why it should impact everybody, even those who aren't directly affected by unemployment. Okay? All right, one thing, we want to talk about the unemployment rate, first of all. I know there's a slide that deals with this in particular, but we want to talk about the unemployment rate, which is expressed as a percentage. Okay? Right now, the unemployment rate nationally is in the high 4s, about 4.8%, something like that. And when we talk about the unemployment rate, basically what we're talking about is this. We're talking about the number of people who are unemployed the number of people who are unemployed, and we've got very definite distinctions as to who is employed, who is not employed, divided by the number of people in the labor force, and I'm going to define them in a minute. And then we simply multiply that by 100 in order to get rid of, because we're going to end up with a decimal. To get rid of the decimal sign, we multiply it by 100. That moves the decimal 2 points to the left, and so that we can express it as a percentage, which is how we are used to seeing unemployment. There are a lot of things in economics we are used to seeing expressed as a percentage. Inflation rate, unemployment rate being two of those. Also interest rates. We like to see what that is in terms of percentages. And so a lot of these percentages make a difference. And so in order for us to do it, we take these absolute values and we convert them to a percentage by using, by multiplying by 100. Let's define the labor force. Okay, the labor force is interesting. It includes everybody working, plus those who are unemployed and who are looking for work, who are actively looking for work. So it looks like, and I know I've heard this for a very long time, that the labor force also includes these people here among the ranks of the unemployed. And I know there's always a lot of consternation and confusion about that. It's like, why would the government do that unless it's trying to double count by trying to pump up the denominator to get a lower unemployment rate? It sounds like a good conspiracy theory, but it's not what's going on. The presumption is if you're unemployed, you're still in the labor force and therefore accounted for here in the denominator as well, because the assumption that you're going to return to the labor force at some point. Because who's in the labor force? Obviously, anybody who works. Part-time, full-time doesn't make a difference. As long as you're working, you're accounted for in the labor force. How do we know who's in the labor force and who's not? Well, if you're in the labor force, you're presumably paying payroll taxes or your employer is withholding for taxes, and a lot of other ways, such as through making workers' comp payments in some states like New Mexico, also withholding for things like state income tax, federal income tax, and unemployment, or for even things like unemployment, which isn't paid by the employee, but is paid for by employers. A lot of these are ways that we can account for. And if you're self-employed, you presumably pay that in the form of what's called an estimated tax once a quarter. If you're not doing that, then you've got a problem at some point, but you should, if you're self-employed, be doing that. So the unemployed, people who are unemployed, who are presumed to be wanting to be working again, are considered part of the labor force because they're not out of it. There are those who are in fact out of it though, and who is not included in the labor force. And sometimes in order to understand what the labor force is, it's probably as easy to talk about what it is not. In other words, who's out of the labor force. It would include anybody who does not work at all. It includes children, typically under 16. And by the way, there is sometimes you might see on the news or hear on the news, non-farm payrolls, that term non-farm payrolls, which includes basically everybody who doesn't work on a farm or a ranch. The reason that's difficult is that a lot of people from a very early age work on farms and work in ranches, even as a kid, under age 16. We don't really want to include them in the labor force because that's still more household labor, or it's considered household labor than it is, market-based wage labor. And they may or may not be compensated, by the way, too. And they're probably not paying any taxes either. So non-farm payrolls is what typically is what's being looked at here, non-farm payrolls. That includes ranches as well, okay? So anybody who doesn't work is not in the labor force. Anybody who's retired who doesn't work. And if you're retired, you work a couple of days a week, then that puts you back in the labor force. People who are totally disabled and can't work for whatever reason are not included in the labor force. Somebody who decides that maybe someone who's inherited a lot of wealth and never works is not in the labor force. Okay. Also, people who are behind bars or not in the labor force. I know that they are put to work doing certain things like making license plates and whatnot. That's not really a market-based wage, certainly not a market-based wage, but also not market-based labor. And so they are not included in the labor force either. And that's a pretty good size of our population. So when we talk about the people who are in the labor force and we divide it by the total population, we end up with what's called labor force participation, which you can read about in the book if you like. I don't believe that I want to spend a lot of time covering that. Labor force participation is basically the percentage of the population that's working. That percentage has actually come down since the last recession, which has got some people kind of worried because of the idea of what's going to happen as older Americans begin moving their way through their working years and drop out of the labor force due to retirement. and they're followed up by fewer and fewer younger workers who are needed to pay the payroll taxes, to pay the Social Security and Medicare, which are only going up over time. It's a big question. It's a question of what to do about it. The fact that baby boomers, of whom I'm on the very tail end, have not had the same rate of reproduction, if you like, that previous generations have had. And so as a result, there are fewer younger people who are working in order to pay for that growing cohort of older workers. So it's going to be an interesting issue. And the baby boomers are only now starting to retire. And so we'll have to see what happens as they move through those phases. Okay. All right. So let's talk a bit about the types of unemployment. And there's a slide in your slide package that talks about the three kinds of unemployment. And they are frictional, structural, and cyclical. And I want to talk about what those are individually. And your slide package, as well as your book, gives definitions. And so I won't repeat the definition necessarily here on the board. But what I will do is sort of give some examples of these three kinds of unemployment. And because sometimes I think examples will obviously help you understand what's going on here. So the first of these types of unemployment is frictional. We define frictional as being simply something, and the word frictional comes from the idea there's something that's just, it's a timing issue, it's something incidental, it's just a cause, it's sort of the junk drawer, if you like, of causes of unemployment. It's really a hodgepodge of different things. And we're going to say that it's natural, normal to have these kinds of things. It could include simply people quitting a job and picking up another job in another month. Whether they have that job in hand prior to quitting or not is mostly irrelevant for our purposes. It's something it's due to what we call incidental reasons. And there could be all kinds of numbers why people are out of work, all kinds of reasons. And they may have nothing to do whatsoever with the economy. It may just have to do with the workers themselves. And so as a result, it doesn't really, it's not really one that's a cause, but it's a big one though. The frictional employment is a pretty big category. So what are some examples of frictional unemployment? Well, it could be something like job changers or job changers, which we could also simply call career switchers. People leaving, whether they're changing careers or just changing jobs, it's the same idea. Somebody has a job, they want to go somewhere else. And there's a lag time between quitting one's job and getting another job. Sometimes one of the great things about getting a new job is the fact that your new job doesn't start up for a couple of weeks or so after you end your present job. And so you get a couple of weeks off. And that sometimes is welcome, or a month off or whatever. Unless you are going to really miss those paychecks, then it may not be that big of a deal. And sometimes your paychecks are a little bit lagging anyway. And so it's even more of a mitigation of whatever damage that might do. Again, we're not considering most of this to be a real serious macroeconomic problem. Career switchers, this is happening more and more. I throw that up there as a separate category, mostly because there are a lot of people now who are simply leaving one career and going on to another. I'm really on my second career of teaching. I was in the financial services industry for a little over 20 years, and I was teaching part-time as an adjunct, before going back to grad school. And but I left banking, a few years ago, and just do this now. I switched careers. Is it somewhat related? It's a little bit, but it's a little bit different too. So career switchers could be one of those. It could also be something of an example of simply layoffs. Whether it's temporary or permanent doesn't make any difference. And I'll go ahead and I know sometimes we refer to this more as temporary, but it could be permanent. And it may have nothing to do with the fact the economy is in dire straits. May have nothing to do with it. There are cases in which firms will simply lay workers off because they feel it's the right business decision to do. Maybe the place where they're doing whatever they're doing isn't profitable anymore, so they want to close that and leave. Maybe a restaurant chain, and it turns out that you don't like being in Ann Arbor, Michigan, or wherever, okay, or or Goshen, Indiana, or Hobbs, New Mexico, and so you decide we want to leave. Meaning all the workers are sent away, discharged from work. So in this case, being a permanent, or it could be temporary. Layoffs happen, and it may not be. And I know that sometimes people want to sort of blow that up and say, well, the economy must be terrible because they're laying everyone off here or laying off everyone off there. Could be, the economy could be in a terrible case, in a terrible situation. And we'll get to that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. Even firms that are making gigantic amounts of money will sometimes lay people off because of the fact that they want to sort of redeploy, move workers around elsewhere. You know, I have a relative who was working for Dow Chemical, and they wanted to move everyone to the home office in Michigan, in the middle of Michigan, which meant a lot of people had to move or not move and lose their job. And so people had to make a decision as to what to do. So temporary or permanent layoffs could be an example of it. It can also be things like recent graduates. This is one that's obvious. Recent graduates, people graduating from a program, degree program or whatever, and are looking for work. And so there's a period of time in which they're not working and they're looking for work. And they would be frictionally unemployed to the extent that they're looking for work. Sometimes it takes a while to get a job once you've graduated from a program. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes people have jobs in hand even before they graduate. And so they intend to stay or they intend to go somewhere else, but others do not. And so as a result, recent graduates who are looking for work will be part of that category. There's also something, and I put this in quotes because I think it's kind of a little bit of a outdated term, something called trailing spouses, which somebody in the class, we actually, in the class that we did have somebody called that the second body person or the two body person, I think it was. It's basically, they don't have to be spouses, they don't even have to be related. It's if one person leaves, usually the geographical area, to go take a job somewhere else, that person's significant other or child or parent or whomever will decide to go along, meaning that they're out of work because somebody else who is significant to them is leaving to take a job elsewhere, meaning they're thrown out of work for whatever period of time it takes them to connect. And sometimes this is a serious issue if the one who's got the good job really wants to go, the other doesn't want to go, and that's a whole other can of worms. But also that the one who does not have a job, who is therefore trailing and is just simply following along, may not be able to find work in that particular area. If you're in the insurance business and you're an insurance underwriter and you live in Omaha, Nebraska, where there are lots of insurance companies, and your spouse decides to take a job in Arizona, where there aren't very many insurance companies, that might put you in sort of a difficult position. You may have to do something different, which means you're frictionally unemployed in that particular case. So that's an example. Also, simply involuntary terminations would be part of this. And I can't recall if I talked about this on the class session. For those of you who are looking at this again, involuntary terminations, in other words, just simply being fired. Involuntarily, you just get fired, and it does happen. Whether you've done anything wrong or not, people do get fired for all kinds of reasons. And you know, even there are employers who are notorious for firing people for the slightest infraction, because it's simply, if you want to look at it cynically, you could say it sort of terrorizes the rest of the labor force. You can view it that way if you like, but it does have the effect of keeping everybody in line. I know my cousin and her husband worked for UPS, and UPS was known to be a very, very strict employer, to the point where one of the drivers had stepped over a line in the post office, and the postman told her to get back behind the line, and she didn't get back quickly enough. He called the supervisor at UPS, and she was terminated, standing over a line, if you can believe it. And which, you know, and I said, well, I think that's a little extreme, but they, you know, it's not exactly like throwing a punch at a boss or, you know, showing up drunk. I mean, that's a little bit, you know, that's a pretty minor infraction. But involuntary terminations, you can be fired for whatever particular reason, which is not the same necessarily as layoffs. Where layoffs are usually made in sort of a mass event. Involuntary terminations, usually individual sorts of events. And what else can we say here about frictional unemployment? The list can be fairly long. In this category here, you could be talking about people who simply pick up and leave their job because they feel like they can find another job elsewhere. And this is particularly good, particularly applicable when you've got somebody who's got lots of skills in an area that's in high demand, where they decide that the slightest infraction being caused by the employer is enough to make them want to quit. And so they end up terminating their own employment and then finding work elsewhere at some point, or feeling like they can. And I've known some people who've got skills like that who've been able to do that. And that's turning the tables on the employer, isn't it? It's saying that we can do the same thing. Okay, so those are frictional employment. Second of these is quite different, and it's a little bit more problematic. It's structural unemployment. Structural unemployment is simply defined as being a mismatch between the demand for labor and whatever people are supplying for that labor, and whatever's being supplied is not in demand for whatever reason. Okay, And it could be that's labor being replaced by technology. Technology has, and over time, by the way, this is something that we all are aware of, whether we give it any thought or not. There are jobs that used to exist that no longer really, simply because technology has replaced them. There used to be a lot more people employed as telephone operators than what they are today. People don't really feel like they need operators as much. You certainly don't need an operator to connect to make a phone call for you, like a long distance call. It's almost hard to believe you would have to involve an operator to make a long distance call. You see old television shows where it's person to person, it's like, what does that even mean? We don't no longer have that. The people employed in that have been replaced by technology. You don't need to involve an operator. Even for an overseas call, you don't need to involve an operator. Where I can remember, I'm old enough to remember where that was usually facilitated, depending upon the country. Okay, so labor has been replaced by technology. Elevator operators, believe it or not, people were employed to press the button to take you to the 5th floor or whatever. Those are jobs that are gone. Now, those are in other jobs that have long since gone, like blacksmiths, mostly gone, chimney sweeps, mostly gone. Yeah, there's still some out there, I'm sure, but not in significant numbers. When it becomes more contemporary, are people in manufacturing whose jobs are being replaced. And there's a whole lot of manufacturing, which is a lot of the work is being done by robots. The auto industry being an example of that. Tremendous amount of robotics used in manufacturing today. That labor is not going to be coming back. And so as a result, there's a mismatch. You were employed by Chrysler to weld quarter panels onto the body of cars, but now a robot can do that. So as a result, that job is gone, and it's probably not coming back. Okay, this is the most problematic. This whole category of structural is the most problematic for a lot of different reasons. Also, one that we've heard a lot about in the last few years is something called outsourcing, also known as offshoring, and that's simply where a producing firm, will locate operations elsewhere, almost always due to cost. Not always cost, sometimes it's regulation. A lot of places in the world don't have quite the stringent same sorts of regulation when it comes to things like environmental controls and whatnot, or hours worked, or wages paid. Minimum wage laws may not exist, or maybe much, much, much lower. A lot of parts of the world, workers who do the same job as some here in the US earn a fraction of the wage that is earned here. And so obviously the motivation for an employer / producer to move is there to do that. We've seen this happening a lot, particularly in manufacturing, where a lot of manufacturing has left the United States, has gone elsewhere. It's probably not coming back. Probably not anytime soon. It's probably not coming back anytime soon. Okay. So questions about any of that? I guess I shouldn't ask questions because nobody's there. Sorry about that. That's sort of an instinct for me to say, are there questions? So I apologize for that. So outsourcing, also known as offshoring, moving production locations elsewhere. And those jobs are not really coming back. And so there are probably a lot of different examples of this, but and we'll talk about why this is problematic here in just a second. So that's the second category of unemployment. And the third category is one that I think probably a lot of people think the most about, and that's cyclical unemployment, which is simply those people who are out of work because of poor business conditions. And this would be the case of poor business conditions and layoffs due to poor sales, due to slow sales or non-existent sales, whatever, as a result. So it's not just retail, it could be production, all kinds of things, layoffs due to that. Poor business conditions. You could make an argument that taxes and regulation can cause that, but that's probably a little bit more difficult argument to make. It's usually poor business conditions that are causing the unemployment. As a result, people are out of work, but the idea is that it is considered to be temporary. And once the economy picks back up, those people will be back to work. So cyclical unemployment. Now we see this in industries that are notably cyclical. And in other words, they rise and fall, their employment rises and falls dramatically with the rise and fall of the economy because the industries in which they operate are very cyclical. That is, they track along with the business cycle, meaning what? That whatever they're producing and providing for sale is a normal good. Normal goods, again, are goods which go along with the business cycle. So if the economy is doing well, those industries do well. Things like tourism and travel do well. Entertainment does well during upturns in the economy. Things like luxury goods sell much better than they do in a downturn. If the economy is doing poorly, then things like luxury goods are going to sell quite badly. So because they're being normal goods. So if you're working for a jewelry store, for instance, you probably are going to suffer the effects of a downturn in the economy. People are going to probably buy less jewelry and expensive watches and bracelets and whatnot when the economy is doing poorly. So the goods so there are a lot of things which are cyclical. Now, one that we haven't covered here, in that there's an occasion where some economists will produce a fourth category called seasonal unemployment, but we would simply lump that into frictional unemployment. At least I would, and most economists I think would. Seasonal unemployment, and that is, this is why I left some space here, and that is the example, people who are out of work because whatever time of year it is no longer applicable to their particular line of work. So ski instructors and lifeguards and people who work selling, popcorn and drinks at Isotopes Park, people working in amusement parks, tax preparers, some agricultural workers, in some parts of the country, even construction workers. In a hard, cold months of winter, there's not a lot of construction going on. That would all be seasonal unemployment. And then it's really an element of frictional. It's an incidental cause. It's not due to the worker, any problem with the worker necessarily. It's no problem with the economy necessarily. It's just simply something that is happening, okay? So that would be an example of seasonal employment. People who are going to be out of work, it's not a crisis because they knew it was going to happen. As a result, there's not a big deal as a result of it, okay? So if we talk about what some of these issues are, and we said that with frictional employment, there's no problem with the worker, there's no problem with the economy. These are incidental issues, and so as a result, government doesn't need to do anything. There's really nothing for the government to do in the case of frictional employment because, number one, you're not going to stop it. Number two, it's considered to probably be pretty good, particularly if people are moving around, switching jobs, because it means that they may be going to more. I mean, if you voluntarily do that, you're probably getting a higher pay, which is good. You're probably going to an area of the economy that's growing and needs the labor, which is good. And by the way, at the moment, we have lots of areas of the economy where that's the case, particularly in technology and in healthcare. Those are areas that are growing and are desperately needing people. So career switchers and job changers are needed. This is why we've got the our coding boot camp, which is, what is it, 6 or 8 weeks or 14 weeks or whatever, depending upon the program. You could be done here and you can move on to make a job making greater than the average salary with no college degree. It's just a certificate. So, but it's a high demand job. If it weren't in demand, you probably wouldn't have that kind of a wage right out of the bat. So we're saying there's no problem with the economy when there is frictional unemployment. And we're not saying there's anything wrong with the workers in this particular case. Even involuntary terminations, you could be laid off for whatever reason. Let's say you did throw a punch at a boss that would land you as unemployed. We're not saying that makes you unemployable, simply makes you unemployed for the time being. The assumption being that you'll be back in the labor force at some time, okay? Remember, you're in the numerator, unemployed, but not out of the labor force. Unless you are in the labor force because you're not working and not looking for work, and that's the other issue on the labor force. You've got to be looking for work to be counted part of the labor force. If you stop looking, then you're called discouraged worker and you're out of the labor force, okay? Structural unemployment, there's no good way to put this, but the problem is with the worker, and there's really no problem with the economy, unless you believe, as some politicians do, that people should not be out of work because these changes are happening that cause people to be out of work, such as technology, outsourcing, and whatnot. And we know that we've heard from politicians who are pledged to put a stop to outsourcing. I know John Kerry, when he ran for president in 2004, said he was going to put an end to the companies packing up and leaving and moving to China and to Malaysia and Mexico and wherever. Well, he wasn't elected, first of all, so that didn't happen. But secondly, nobody thought it was really even much of a threat, because what's to stop anybody from leaving, and going somewhere else? The government can't stop you from producing or even tell you have to produce. You can just close your firm anytime you like and just start up somewhere else. There's nothing stopping you. you could try to tax it, but it was probably illegal to do that. So we're saying the problem is with the worker. That, again, that's an insensitive way of putting it, and I realize that. I know that. But the onus or the burden here is with the worker. And what makes this difficult is the fact that, number one, there's a real timing issue here where people sometimes don't realize that their job is gone and whatever they were doing is not going to be available again. We certainly saw this with the auto industry, which had a near collapse in this country, particularly with GM and Chrysler, which needed government bailouts in 2008, 2009. Those firms would have, I think, no doubt failed. They might have, I know GM actually did go through bankruptcy, and might have been an entirely different company were it not for government help. And Chrysler, got some help as well. Ford didn't quite need the help as much, but they would have been on their way out the door, without that. But that was a little bit more of a difficult issue. That was probably more of a cyclical thing than it was structural in some ways. Okay, so but it does take time, and even before those problems that happened in 2008, 2009, that were brought on by problems in real estate and in finance, the auto industry was going through some issues where a lot of people were losing their jobs and they weren't coming back. And they were moving to lower cost areas. And by the way, it doesn't even have to be offshoring. It could be simply moving to low cost areas, lower labor cost areas, moving from Ohio to Tennessee. We've seen a lot of places in the South where lower wages are a bit lower in the United States South than they are in the upper Midwest and on the East Coast. We've seen there's a BMW plant in South Carolina. There's I'm trying to think what the plant is in Tennessee. Maybe it's a Subaru plant. You get the idea that some of those wages are less. And the people who lost their work elsewhere generally don't move. Sometimes they do, but sometimes not. Structurally unemployed. So the issues with the worker. Now, if you believe the government should do something about it, some do. They'll offer things like job training and retraining. And certainly CNN does its part in that area. We have all kinds of programs to sort of retrain people in different occupations, where there's demand. And the vocational part of CNN has certainly, I think, helped the local economy in providing people to take these jobs that are in demand right now, that just need people who are qualified and able to work as EMTs and as nurses and as radiologic technicians and as pipe fitters and welders, all shortages of labor in these particular areas. So problems with the worker, no problem with the economy, no government action needed. Cyclical unemployment, no problem with the worker, the problem is with the economy. So this is the only one of these that we can say the problem is with the economy, and therefore requires government action, and that government action takes the form of stimulus. And we're going to be talking about the term stimulus a lot. I know everyone has heard that term over and over again, particularly the last couple of years, but it's one that's been around for a very long time in economics. And that is the idea of government providing some sort of boost to the economy, some sort of kickstart, so that the economy moves back to full employment. And that's really what stimulus is all about. It can take the form of what we call fiscal stimulus, that is the tax policy of government spending or whatnot, or it can take the form of monetary stimulus. And we're going to get into that a bit later, probably in next week's class session. We'll get into monetary policy. Okay. All right. So those cover the top three kinds of unemployment. And again, sometimes seasonal will be broken out as a separate one, but that's usually not what we want to do here. I do want to talk about this idea of employment and full employment, because I talked about this idea of moving toward full employment. When we talk about full employment, what we're really talking about is this. Full employment is a condition where the only two kinds of unemployment that exist are frictional and structural. Okay? Full employment. In other words, frictional and structural. Full employment means there is no cyclical unemployment. Oops, no cyclical, misspelled cyclical. There is no cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment, if there were cyclical unemployment, then there would be government action needed. But in the case of full employment, which, by the way, is again expressed as a percentage, right? And so now that begs the question, well, what is that percentage? What is the percentage that we should hang our hats on us and say, hey, we've reached full employment because the unemployment rate is X percent? And the answer is it's not known. And the answer is also that idea of what is full employment has changed over the years. I know when I was an undergraduate that we were thinking 7% would be an acceptable full employment rate of unemployment. So an unemployment rate that was 7% would account for everybody who's frictionally and structurally unemployed and no cyclical unemployment, meaning everybody who wants to work can find work. It's just a matter of getting it done. That they're not going to be out of work simply because businesses don't want to hire because the economy is poor and they're waiting for a rebound. It's they're trying to put it together either through changing jobs or career changing or going back to get some additional training or whatever. So 7% was thought to be it. But now in recent years, I think the feeling is more between 4 and 5%. And one of the reasons for that is the fact that technology, frankly, has assisted in this a lot. That there used to be lots and lots of time lags involved when there was unemployment, because the traditional way for decades was that people would mail out resumes or go fill out an application physically and turn it in. And something physical would sit on someone's desk and maybe get lost and maybe get directed here to somebody who's on vacation right now. So it sits in their mailbox for a week. Today, employers is likely to have their own job boards that you can post to right away, boom. However long it takes you to fill out the documentation there and upload your resume or your curriculum vitae, whatever, transcripts, whatever it is you want to upload, you can do it pretty quickly. And it will land somewhere and somebody will see it probably much quicker than what they used to in years past. Also, some of these sites like Indeed and some of the other ones do actually work as a service more for employers than employees or would-be employees. And if you ever listen to Indeed's advertising, it's really tailored more toward employers saying you can find a worker quicker. Now, it doesn't mean that you as an employee or a job seeker shouldn't go there. In fact, you probably should, particularly if you're smart enough to use certain buzzwords that will, that match pretty much exactly what they're looking for, so that the technology can sort you out and route you to where you need to be. And so the lag time of people being unemployed is much, much shorter now, simply because of technology matching people up better. Also, if you don't match up, and maybe it's your own mistake in not matching up with the right kind of buzzwords and whatnot, but you're probably not going to get routed, so to wherever you need to be, and so you probably will quickly understand that you need to sort of change your job search. But in reality, though, you'll probably get a job faster using those methods than before. It used to be just an onerous, months-long process to get any kind of a job. It doesn't seem to be taking quite that long anymore. Okay? And some jobs don't require a resume, and so just a matter of showing up. And right now, the demand for labor is so high, I think you can probably walk in a lot of places and just apply. And as long as you meet their minimum requirements, you probably have got a job. And they're asking you, when can you start? I have a relative who just lives in Colorado, just got a job. And they were going to offer him, I think it was $15 per hour. And he said, no, I need $18 per hour. And I thought that was a little bit audacious for the job he was doing. And they said they had to think about it. And they didn't take very long to think about it. It took like a day. It's okay, $18 an hour. And so that's a pretty good wage for what is, I think, a probably fairly semi-skilled job. And he's clicking his heels about that. So, that's the kind of labor market we're in right now. It's a growing economy, a very tight labor market. A lot of people not returning to the labor force for whatever reason. And in fact, and you could look at it one way, that we have regrettably lost a number of people who have died from COVID. And so it's a very sad story, but it has happened. It has happened. That tends to have been concentrated more among older members of the population, but there have been younger workers as well who've been impacted. Okay, so full employment is a percentage that corresponds to no cyclical unemployment. Only frictional and structural is it. Okay, so those are the only kinds that are allowed to exist in this particular model here. Okay, if there is structural unemployment, then the difference between the unemployment rate and the full employment rate of unemployment has got to be cyclical. So if we say this is 5%, right, and the unemployment rate, the actual unemployment rate is 8%, and 8 minus 5 has got to be 3%. That is all cyclical. So as a result, government should do something about that 3% unemployment, because we're going to say these are inevitable. They're going to happen. Even the structural part of it, as regrettable as it is going to happen. People are going to lose their work because their skills are going to go away. And the jobs are going to leave and they're not going to come back. And I think we can say this about a lot of jobs that we have had, or that probably are not going to come back. I am pretty sure that some of the jobs I had in banking probably don't exist anymore. And I would be a very poor match if I decided to try to come back. Okay. All right. So that's full employment as a concept related to the percentage. But what about we have, and I'm going to go and erase some of this here. What about full employment GDP? And so in other words, full employment GDP is considered to be the GDP. Again, that's a dollar figure, right? So if this is a percentage, and this is a dollar figure that corresponds to whatever amount of output and income in the economy corresponds to 0% cyclical unemployment, or in other words, full employment. So that's what's called full employment unemployment. It's also known sometimes as something called the NAIRU, which we're not going to use a lot in this class here, which is a term that stands for the non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment. It corresponds to that. In other words, but this is an unemployment rate, and that's a dollar figure, so it corresponds, I should say, to the NAIRU. It also corresponds to what's called the natural rate of unemployment, right? Even though one is a percentage and one is a dollar figure, I get that. That's why I'm saying it's not equal, because they're of different denominations, but you get the idea of what's going on. But when we talk about something which is in the same denomination, where you've got some actual GDP, whatever the GDP is, that let's say it's less than, well, no, let's say it's not equal to, for whatever reason, and we'll get to the full employment rate of unemployment being higher or lower. When it's actual, then you end up with something that's called an output gap. An output gap. And the output gap is simply the fact that there's a difference between actual production of output and income in the economy and what would be full employment. And when you have a condition which the actual unemployment, when the actual GDP is less than full employment GDP, and we say this is a recessionary gap, a negative output gap or a recessionary gap. That is, the actual amount of output and income that's being produced is less than what would be produced in conditions associated with full employment. So as a result, it's a gap measured in dollar terms, by the way, measured in dollar terms, even though unemployment is expressed as a percentage, it's the GDP which corresponds to that percentage. If it's different and it's on the low side, it's a recessionary gap. If it's different on the high side, where it's greater than it, then we have a positive gap, what we call an inflationary gap, which may be sort of where we are at the moment. Only how long it's going to last, who knows? And we're going to talk much more about where we are at the moment, just in order to explain something, because it actually is a sort of interesting time to be taking a macro course, given the condition of inflation, because the kind of inflation we're seeing fits into one or two categories, which I'll get to here shortly. And it's that second category, which is less common. And we don't really associate it as much with what we see historically in terms of inflation, from our understanding of inflation and our measurement of it over time. Okay. All right. So that sort of does it for what we want to talk about with regard to the definitional items. I want to talk a little bit about what some of the problems with unemployment are. And I want to sort of present this from the standpoint of saying that even though maybe you've got a very secure job, maybe you work as a teacher or a police officer, and are probably not subject to layoff given the area where you are, or maybe you work for you're in the military and are not subject to layoff, then the question would be, well, why do I care about unemployment? What's in it for me? Or maybe I'm retired and I get Social Security and a pension. None of those are in doubt. So why do I care about if people are losing their jobs? Well, beyond the fact that maybe you want to care about people not working, there are also some other issues which impacts the broader economy, which is why I think most of us have an interest in seeing that unemployment is as low as possible, that we're at or near full employment. So the first of these is the fact of what the role of government is and what's being asked of government. Number one, the results, higher unemployment means lower income throughout the economy, lower corporate income, lower personal income, lower disposable income. So as a result, what does that mean? One thing begets the other. If a business isn't making as much money, they don't have as much money to pay workers for wages. Things like overtime that might used to exist no longer exist, and so people's wages are lower. And so they're spending less. So if they're spending less, it means corporate profits are lower. It's this feedback loop that we call a vicious cycle, right? Firms are earning less, and so they employ less. People are employing less, they spend less. As they spend less, firms earn less, and it goes round and round. Something's got to intervene and break that cycle, and that's why, for those economists, most of us believe that there is a way to intervene in that vicious cycle to sort of cut that off before it works its way all the way down into a full-blown depression, which could happen. It has happened historically. It has happened historically. Even the imprecise measures that we've got from the 19th century indicate at least 3 major depressions in the 19th century and 1 big one in the 20th century throughout the 1930s. So that sort of vicious cycle can take hold. But as to the role of government, all this means the government's getting less money while it's being asked to spend more to support the public in general. So even though the government's getting less money because less money is being made by corporations, paying less corporate tax, people are buying less because they have lower incomes, so they're paying less income tax, paying less sales tax because they're buying less stuff subject to sales tax, but all the while demanding more of government in the form of higher transfer payments like unemployment, Medicaid, food assistance, housing assistance, transportation assistance. It's a long list of all these requirements. So government's being asked to, it's a push and pull, being asked to do 2 different things, do more with less. So that's a problem. It's a contradictory set of circumstances that we present government with when we are paying them less and asking for more, okay? So that's difficult, okay? Also, it's difficult for people who are out of work longer to get work again for whatever reasons. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. One of them comes back to this idea of structural unemployment. If you've been out of work for a while, things simply change and you no longer have some of the same sorts of skills. And as a result, you really are not in demand for that particular reason. If you were working as a tax accountant for a number of years and you've been out and you haven't done it for a few years, and so we've had some pretty major changes to the tax code, especially in the corporate tax code. You may not be that attractive to employers in the accounting profession unless you really can convince them that you're up to speed on what's going on with the new tax laws that were enacted in 2017. That's one example. I know that there was a friend of mine who was a computer scientist who took a couple of years off to do some things, to take care of her parents who were both elderly, and then came back sometime afterwards and found that she had a little bit of trouble reintegrating simply because things were changing. And there was some major change to some major enterprise software that she was not familiar with. And it was problematic to say, hey, I'll be able to pick it up. Please hire me. And at the time she was looking, it was not the right time. So you get the idea. It's difficult the longer you're out to find work. And also this goes to what I would sort of call fairly or unfairly, or whether it's right or wrong or ethical, unethical, a sort of bias on the part of employers who sometimes wonder why people have been out of work for as long as they've been out of work. And if the reason isn't good enough in their eyes, which is strictly subjective, obviously, then it could be a negative against the job applicant. If you've been out of work for a couple of years, it's one thing to say, well, I took time off when I had my second child or whatever. That is usually a pretty good explanation, and most employers have no trouble accepting that. If you don't have a good explanation, then the questions arise. And I used to hire people and I would get applications and I would ask about these missing time frames. And the thought would go through my head, rightly or wrongly, maybe it was a little bit of, I tried not to be involved in creating alternative scenarios that I wasn't aware of, but I didn't know what I didn't know, And were you in jail for a couple of years? And what's it going to take for me to find out that? How do I find out what has been going on? Why haven't you been able to get back to work? And by the way, if you're a really good worker, why hasn't somebody snatched you up? That is oftentimes what gets thought of when somebody's been out of work for a couple of years. If you're this hotshot engineer, then why have you been out of work for 5 years? Good question. You need a good story. The longer you've been out, longer. And if you're an engineer, then are you going to be up to speed on what's going on if you're trying to reintegrate to the workforce? That's difficult. And by the way, we've seen a return of people who've been retired who are coming back into the workforce because there's simply a demand for them. People who, maybe were in their 50s, 60s, whatever, decided to retire, but now they're really demanded and they go back and maybe things have changed enough that it's difficult for them to reintegrate. So that's a problem. Okay, so that's an issue there. It also affects lower income households much more than higher income households. This goes without saying. By the way, this is going to be a recurring theme everywhere throughout macroeconomics. It is an unfortunate aspect of economics in general, and that is whatever bad thing is afflicting the economy, whether it's unemployment, whether it's inflation, whether it's environmental damage, whether it's whatever. I mean, almost anything you can think of, it's going to affect lower income households more than higher income households and in bad ways. It's not going to usually affect them in a positive way. It's going to affect them in a worse way. That's just the unfortunate reality. which tells you then that it would be better off to have a higher income than a lower income. Not that that's a particularly brilliant statement, but we're going to show why that's the case. With lower income households, obviously losing a job can be a major, major, major crisis immediately. A higher income household, a physician loses his or her job or quits his or her job, probably will find work soon, probably has enough savings to be on cruise control for a year or two or whatever, or longer. A lower income worker doesn't have the savings built up, presumably can't take that longer than what somebody of a higher income could. Immediate decisions have to be made. How do we pay this particular bill? How do we do this? And there's a friend of mine who's a therapist, a family psychologist, family therapist, who said that one of the big stressors that she runs across is people unemployed, because there's immediate friction over money and all that. Money is a big conflict within households and marriages, and you could see how marriages would have difficulties, trying to decide what are the priorities given our reduced, the constraints on our income, our reduced circumstances. So higher income households, not so much the case at all. In fact, there are cases in which higher income people simply walk away from work, hoping to find work elsewhere, simply because something isn't going their way, whatever the case might be. Okay? It's also, it affects minority groups, whatever the minority group, whether it's racial, ethnic, or gender, much more than non-minority groups. This is simply measurable over time. Labor economists have been very clear about this, that those groups tend to be much more disadvantaged by unemployment as a reality than do non-minority groups. And it's also associated with, as I sort of mentioned this earlier, with a lot of social ills like family stress, marital breakup, loss of homes, loss of vehicles, things like that. Lots of problems that come as a result of that. Also, one thing that we should talk about is that substance abuse tends to pick up very dramatically during rising times of unemployment, in particular alcohol consumption. There is a definite connection between level of personal and household income macroeconomically and the macroeconomic level of alcohol consumption. As the economy takes a downturn, alcohol consumption picks up. As the economy picks up, alcohol consumption goes down. So in other words, it makes it an inferior good. And again, the term inferior has to do with the income flowing to the buyers of the goods. I remember in the 80s, when the economy was doing very, very well, unemployment was falling dramatically, but there were a couple of distillers, companies that made like gin or vodka, whatever, who were considering bankruptcy because their sales had just plummeted. People weren't drinking as much, and they were more health conscious and whatnot. And that seemed, and a lot of people were thinking, when would you ever have seen a manufacturer of liquor go out of business? But that was being faced in a number of cases. And so those kinds of issues do arise as an inferior good. And also the whole issue of wealth loss, we talked about loss of homes, vehicles, and whatnot. So again, it's a major cause of stress. Okay. All right, then finally, to sort of finish this up here before we move into the inflation piece, I want to talk about underemployment as a special kind of unemployment. That's not really unemployment at all, but it is something that is a condition of suboptimal use of the labor force. If we are just taking, again, the unemployment part of this is not unemployment of labor or of machines and capital goods like buildings and whatnot, but we're talking about people. And so as an example, underemployment is a condition of not unemployment, but of underutilization. So it's a form of unemployment, but it doesn't qualify for the exact definition. And there are two common types of these. Number one is somebody who was working full-time, who now can only find part-time work. That person would be considered to be underemployed. They're nowhere are they being accounted for as unemployed because they're working, they're getting a wage, and they're paying taxes and whatnot. They're just not earning as much because they're only working part-time. Some employers cannot and do not offer full-time employment to a large segment of its workforce. You see this a lot in retail, where a lot of retail operations don't offer full-time work to a large section of their workforce, for lots of different reasons. Beyond the obvious payroll expense issue comes things like employee benefits, which full-time workers tend to be more eligible for, including things like not only health insurance and whatnot, but things like pension and retirement, that sort of thing. So underemployment has that form. Somebody working part-time is now, or somebody who was working full-time is now only working part-time. That's a difficult one to measure as well. The only way we can really measure this with any degree of sort of directional input is by looking at what's called the hours worked data. There is something called hours worked, which takes all the hours that the workforce worked in a particular week or month or quarter or whatever, and try to ascertain from that whether or not there are more people working part-time, because otherwise it's difficult to know, because we're really not tracking individuals and their hours worked, you know, on an individual level, but we are on an aggregate level. Okay, so we can infer from that then how many people are not working full-time as once were. And the second one, which is even more difficult to follow, because these may be full-time workers, and that's somebody who is considered to be overqualified. I'll put that in quotes, who is overqualified for the work that they're doing, but they're doing the work, and maybe they're doing a full-time job, maybe they're doing fine, and maybe somebody has no idea that they have those particular skills. And I talked about in my class on Thursday, the very abbreviated class that we did, that my dad had a worker who worked for him in sales, it was a particularly bad time in the economy. He worked for it, did very well, and then decided to leave one day. And my dad said, "Okay, I'm sorry to hear that. What are you going to go do?" And he goes, "I'm going to be an engineer at, I think it was like Dow Chemical." He goes, "You're going to do what?" And he goes, "Yeah, I've got a PhD in chemistry." And it's like, you do? And he didn't mention that when he applied for the job. And he said, "I didn't want you to know." Because he said, "I probably wouldn't have gotten hired." And my dad said, "You're probably right. I probably wouldn't have hired you." And people do that. They sort of, you know, far from pumping up their resume, which is what people think about when they talk about fudging their resume, there are some who dial down the power of the resume just so they can get work, so they won't be excluded, because the employer might think you're overqualified. You know, when I was in retail bank management, I had a lady who worked for us who we had no idea that she had like a master's degree in, I think, German, and then left to go finish her doctoral degree. Yeah, no, and she was working, I think, as a bank teller. And I think probably HR would have asked her a lot of questions before hiring her if, and that was a company where I did not do the hiring. They probably would have asked a lot of questions, and she may not have gotten hired, frankly. And so for those who do it, I'm saying it's probably a logical thing. By the way, they're not, I guess they're only deceiving in terms of omitting something. They're not inventing something like inventing fake high school diplomas and college degrees. But that is an example of somebody who is underemployed. If you're working in a job that you are not are overqualified for, and I put that in quotes because it's a very subjective term, then you're considered unemployed or underemployed. Now, by the way, this could also be a case in which somebody chooses to do this and maybe even is upfront with their employer. My cousin, or my brother's wife was a CPA and decided she hated it. She hated accounting, and she was making a lot of money, but she didn't like her bosses, didn't like her clients, didn't like the hours, and so she, I think she had a teaching certificate because I think she had a double major, and so she decided to go teach elementary. And she was earning a fraction of the wage that she was earning as a CPA, but liked it a lot better. The hours were better. The summers off was nice, all that. So she just chose to be working at a job for which she was, quote unquote, overqualified. Now, I know that elementary teachers have a tough job. I'm not trying to equate that. But what I'm saying is, if you just take a look at earning power, that's all that we're really getting at here is, by contrast, that person will be considered underemployed, but did it by choice and knew what she was getting into. This is not some involuntary situation. Okay. All right. I'm going to hit into the inflation piece in a second here. I'm going to reset a couple of things, and then I will restart with inflation here in just a second. Okay, so to talk about inflation, we should really define what inflation is, because I think that there are some mischaracterizations of inflation, misconceptions about what inflation is, and so we'll need to define it. So as economists, what we would define it really as in two different ways. Number one, it's considered to be a general rise in the overall price level, a general rise in overall prices. And here we want to sort of not think so much about individual goods and the rising prices of individual goods, and sort of disconnect those rising prices from the broader economy. And there are some goods that periodically spike in price, like gasoline, where people will then say, well, it must be that there's inflation in the economy. And that may not even be the case at all. It could be that for its own particular reasons and its own peculiarities within the market for oil and gasoline, that those prices are rising. Whereas there are some prices that may be falling sufficiently that it brings the price level down and not up. So for the most part, the economy tends to inflate over time, and that some of that's due to policy, that sometimes it's an idea that we want to sort of push the envelope a little bit. It's kind of like driving a little bit above the speed limit. You get there a little faster without causing a little bit of extra damage. And so it's sort of pushing the envelope a little bit in order to have a little bit of inflation. Right now, the federal government is thought to favor about a 2% inflation rate. Obviously, we've been way over that the last couple of quarters, and we're going to have to see. It's actually reported on a monthly basis. For the last several months, we've been over that. We'll have to see what happens. So that's one definition. It's the general rise of the overall price level, prices in general, and we have a number of different ways of measuring that. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then the second is it's a fall in the value of money. So one is a manifestation of the physical flow, that is goods prices being higher. And then the second is the actual money itself being worth less. These are the flip sides of the same coin. They mean the same thing, don't they? If it takes me more dollars to buy a washing machine this year than what it took last year for the very same machine, then it's probably the fact that my money has got to be worth less, unless that's a different machine, but we're saying it's the very same machine. Or if it's all goods, if it's gasoline, if it's if it's bread, if it's something that is easy to discern quality differences, and if the fact is that it costs more dollars, then it's going to be attributed to inflation in a lot of cases. And by the way, if you ever wondered, why doesn't the government just simply print more money and just hand it out to people, which, by the way, it's been doing some of that lately, which has got some people think, well, some of the inflation is because of the free money that the government is producing. That's probably part of it. That's probably not the majority of the story, however. But why doesn't the government just give every household $1 million and say every household's a millionaire? Because it would be immediately inflationary, because if money were no more difficult to get than to go to your mailbox and get it, then what would be the value of money in the first place? So it's going to be exchanged for value. That's one of the key attributes there. Okay, and so we know over time that money will lose value because of the fact that it takes more dollars over time to buy the same goods than what it took before. Okay, so we know that those exist. Now, we talked a little bit earlier in this recording about price indexes and what they are. And we simply said that an index is simply a way of tracking the values of things. By the way, these are, excuse me, macro indexes. They're used all throughout economics, micro and macro both, to track the values of things over time. Usually it's set to 100 to sort of make our lives easier when looking at it, because anything divided by itself, if you're taking a base year, if the value is something of 18 divided by 18, it's going to be 1. So if we multiply it by 100, we then inflate, everything starts at a base value of 100. So 100 is typically the base value for an index, but it also gives us a bit of shorthand. So if we're looking at the price index compared to 1950 or whatever, we see that prices are 850 compared to 100. We know the prices have gone up 8.5 times since 1950. They've actually gone up quite a lot higher than that, but you get the idea. That accounts for the depreciation in money and the appreciation in prices, okay? So there are 3 main kind of indexes that we use. The first of these is known as the CPI. The CPI. It's sometimes called the CPI-U because it tracks an urban consumer. And this in itself is a bit controversial. In fact, a lot of the measurements of both inflation and unemployment tends to track urban consumers much more than rural ones. And that in itself is controversial among those who believe that the rural populations don't get enough attention, and they might have a point there. So the CPI-U tracks the price differences that take place over time for an urban consumer. What is it? It's basically household spending. And it takes into account a theoretical, hypothetical, but not that hypothetical market basket of goods, which is several hundred goods, I think it's actually several thousand goods that are included in the price index. And they're tracked over time. And they try to keep goods on an apples and oranges kind of thing, so that if you're tracking the price of a pair of sandals, the sandals are going to be the same in the year 2021 as they are in 2022, as they were in 2015 and whatnot, that there's no huge qualitative difference. But there's a problem with that, isn't it? Because think about this, that occasionally maybe you get a good that is qualitatively much different than what its predecessors were. Think about cell phones, which iPhones and smartphones that are much of higher quality than what the early predecessors were. I mean, the early cell phones are about the size of this, right? They looked like walkie-talkies, right? And didn't really do very much but make phone calls and cost a lot of money, right? Today, the prices come down, the quality has gone up. And so as a result, that qualitative difference means that if you're trying to take that a basket of goods this year versus a basket of goods in 1960 when cell phones didn't even exist, you've got some real issues there. And I'll get to that when we talk about the difficulties with the market basket, okay? The market basket is a collection of goods that, and theoretically, it should be uniform over time. And it's very specific too. If you've ever looked at the goods that go into the market basket, it'll take things like iceberg lettuce, not romaine lettuce or not leaf lettuce or anything like that. It'll be iceberg lettuce of a certain size. And there are people who work for the federal government in the Labor Department who actually call around and go around and track the prices of goods around the country in order to feed the data into giant computers in order to compute the price changes over time. It includes things like car insurance for an F-150, $1,000 deductible or whatever. You get the idea. It's got some very specific things that go into the price index. And so those are tracked at the retail level, okay? At the retail level. This is the one we hear the most about at the retail level. These are goods that are available for final sale to consumers. And so the market basket, which incorporates those goods, are retail goods. So they would not include things like 18-wheelers and printing presses and heavy-duty machinery, things like that. So it also includes some imported goods, which makes our lives a little bit more complicated. We can take imports out, but sometimes the prices of import goods are changing because of changes in the value of the dollar versus other currencies. And this is an area that we used to get into this a bit more in the full term courses, but I have to cut it out, this abbreviated course. That's the idea of currency exchange. If the dollar is rising in value against the euro, for instance, then it means that goods coming from Europe that are denominated in Europe, that is from the Eurozone, are going to be cheaper, relatively speaking, simply because of the exchange value of the dollar. Right now, since the Brexit vote in Britain, the US dollar has gone up tremendously against the British pound, making British imports or imports from Britain less expensive to Americans without anything to do with the quality of the good, the cost of production, nothing like that, just simply as the exchange value, simply because people have less confidence in the British pound, I presume, and have walked away from that because Britain is sort of decoupling itself from Europe and that whole issue there. So it does include the value of imported goods. And as a result, what we almost have to, because one big import beyond food like bananas and sugar and whatnot, one big import is oil. And we do import a lot of oil. And there have been efforts in the last several years to talk about the idea that the US may one day produce all its oil for its own needs, and then may actually be a net exporter of oil. And that could happen. I mean, if you'd asked me 20 years ago, I would have said it's crazy, but there's a lot of drilling that was going on up until about 5 or 6 years ago, particularly in the so-called fracking industry. Fracking is, if you're not familiar with it, it's a play on the word fracturing. It's basically shooting hot water into the ground and breaking the rock to get at places which oil is hiding but couldn't get at as easily. And and that's been going on. We've had it in New Mexico, Colorado, a lot of places that sort of shut down after 2014 when the price of oil collapsed. And then with the the pandemic, that has sort of fallen, but it's coming back. Oil is now about double where it was about 3 years ago. So that's one issue. So the CPI, which affects consumers in this country, does include imported goods. Okay. The second of these is called the PPI. PPI tracks the price of intermediate goods, and this is at what we would call the wholesale level. That is, these are not goods that are ready for sale yet, but it would include all the output of goods that will go into making other goods. And so it has a lot of raw materials, things like aluminum. Nobody goes and buys aluminum as a spare good at Home Depot. They go buy aluminum siding at Home Depot. That's a finished good, but that would go into the CPI. Aluminum that is produced on giant sheets, bigger rolls, that is a wholesale item. That would go into PPI, goods at the wholesale level. By the way, this would include all the output of farmers, because you don't generally consume directly the output of farmers directly, particularly grains and particularly livestock. They're sold to processors who do things with it, and then it's the good that you buy whether it's the bologna or the loaf of bread that comes from that. So all the output is really captured. All the output of farmers and ranchers is included in PPI. Those are goods at the wholesale level. Pretty much all manufacturers, unless they're manufacturing goods that go directly to consumers, those are all captured in the PPI. Now, the significance of this is this, that a lot of economists will watch the trends in this versus the trends in this. And for instance, if they're seeing a pickup in PPI, the index, in 1 month, they can expect it to be passed down along the value chain that may show up in consumer prices a little bit down the road as those goods move from intermediate to finished goods. And it is always the case, but it's sort of a harbinger of things to come. If the prices are rising or falling here, are they going to rise or fall? In the final index, the index of final goods, the CPI, which is coming down the pike. So it's what we would call a leading indicator in economics. That's the idea of something that is telling us something that may happen based upon what we know is observable right now. So that's what the producer price index does. They track them over time at that particular level. And then there's one that's sort of an amalgamation of the CPI without imports and the CPI itself, and it's called the Gdp Deflator. The actual term, which in case you come across it on the internet, is called the Implicit Price Deflator. What it does is it's more comprehensive than the CPI, which is a limited market basket, so it doesn't include every good that every consumer everywhere will buy. But the GDP deflator does tend to do that, picks up many more goods and takes out imports because imports are not made here. That's GD, the D and D, it means for domestic production. And so and that gives us a better idea of what is going on with the factor costs that are contributing to the rise in prices at the retail level. Okay, so the GDP deflator is much more comprehensive. It's much more difficult to read and look at, but it does tend to net those particular things out. Okay, and again, I can do some examples for you individually if you want to contact me as to how to compute different index values and what they mean, and and how do we look at them and compare something from one time period to another. But they are useful in the sense of letting us see how things have changed over time, because we know that goods have changed over time a lot. Just by looking at old TV shows, people buying new cars for $500, or getting a 50-cent an hour raise, which is good, but it's not usually worth doing the handstands you see in old shows, or that seems like a really big deal, right? It's because the value of money has gone down. It takes more money now for the same equivalent sort of purchase the same market basket. So let's talk a bit about what some of these criticisms are of the CPI, because the CPI itself is the most commonly cited measure of consumer prices. In fact, it's reported about once per month and by the Labor Department, and usually comes out on a Friday. The PPI number comes out on a Wednesday usually. A couple days later, the CPI comes out, usually the end of the first week after a month is ended. We usually get that data. So we'll be seeing some data from November in a couple weeks, and we'll see what's happening, because people are really watching inflation numbers a lot, because they have been rising to the point where if you took year over year, I think the most recent data we had from October was that October of 2021 versus October of 2020, prices were up about 6%. That's pretty high for an inflation rate compared to the government's own stated target of 2%. We've blown past 2% at 6%. And now the question is, what is the government going to do about it? And the actor that would do the most about it is the Federal Reserve, and that comes in a little bit of a later segment here, okay? All right, so what are some of the criticisms of this CPI? First of all, one of them is this: it's the urban aspect of it, is that the urban market basket includes goods that only urban consumers would buy and excludes those goods that less urban consumers don't buy, or do buy, but are not included. So think about this, and so it has it both ways. Some goods urban consumers buy and don't buy, some that rural consumers do. Some goods rural consumers buy and urban consumers never buy. So examples, things like taxi fare, subway tickets, parking garage spaces. These are not existent in small rural areas. You wouldn't have to pay for them, right? They don't exist. There is no public transportation in a lot of small towns and rural areas. And we're including small towns in that, which is about, and so that rural population is about a fifth of the population, which is a pretty good proportion of the population that doesn't always get accounted for within that particular measure. So they never ride the subway because they don't have subways in small towns. So you get the idea. So that urban market basket is there. Also, if you're living in an urban, more rural area, you're more likely to buy goods like barbed wire and rototillers and things like fencing and bales of hay, bales of hay that you wouldn't buy living in Chicago, for instance, or New York City. So you get the idea. There are goods included and excluded, but the idea is that those goods wouldn't be there, and so they don't exist. Okay, that's a problem. Also, it doesn't account for the fact that within urban areas, prices of some goods are much more expensive than they are in more rural areas. A hotel room of the same quality in New York City is going to be many times higher, or much higher, maybe not many times, much higher than that in, say, Amarillo. Well, Amarillo is kind of an urban area, but or let's say Hobbs or Portales, right? If there are hotels there, I suppose there are. You get the idea. The prices are going to be much higher for the same quality, but it's a locational difference. So as a result, there are a lot of things that serve to overstate inflation. We'll get to that point here in just a second. So the urban nature of it is problematic. So the issue of overstating is carried out both in its urban issue, but also because of the fact that it doesn't account for some of the following. Number one, the substitution effect, the retail, the discount retail effect, and also the idea of new goods coming in and replacing other goods. All of these contribute to the idea that the raise is exaggerated. So first of all, let's take this idea of COLAs and what they are. What are COLAs? COLAs are simply cost of living adjustments that are used to compensate workers or retirees. So somebody getting a benefit from an employer or past employer relationship, or through Social Security, which compensates them for the loss of purchasing power due to inflation. So if you get Social Security, you'll get a benefit increase. In fact, those recipients of Social Security who are getting that monthly annuity that we call old age survivors insurance, they're going to get a pretty nifty rise in compensation. But it's compensating them for the rise in prices they've had to experience up to now. So as a result of this, if the CPI is overstating the inflation rate, then we are presumably overcompensating those who get cost of living adjustments. Now, most people who are in the workforce today, even those who may work in some of the public sector jobs, don't get cost of living increases per se, right? They're not called that. If you work for a private employer, maybe you get an increase every year, but usually it's something tied to your tenure there, tied to an annual review period, tied to a promotion. They usually don't call it cost of living adjustment. I think they'd rather have it called merit pay or whatever. But there's no, because these things are automatic and you'll get them. These adjustments happen automatically, whether you're a good worker, bad worker, productive, unproductive. But most people don't get them. If you work, in the labor force, most employers don't have that outside of government in particular. But Social Security recipients do. And so there have been a lot of efforts, particularly among members of Congress, to try to dial down some of the cost of living adjustments that Social Security recipients get. A few years ago, when Paul Ryan was the Speaker of the House, there were efforts to try to change the means by which we calculate the inflation rate, the CPI, using something called chained CPI, which I won't go into here. And it ran into lots of opposition from everybody who gets Social Security. It would have probably resulted in a lower amount of cost of living adjustment. And he found out, like a lot of politicians do, that if you try to tinker with Social Security, be careful, because that is a group of people who are very active and who are very active at voting as well. So it's called the third rail in politics, like don't touch the electrified third rail, okay? So that's one issue there when it comes to Social Security. What about the other means by which it might interfere or overstate inflation? What is the substitution effect? It might be this. Maybe sugar is included in the market basket, but yeah, and the price of sugar is skyrocketing for whatever reason. It doesn't matter. Then what if people simply decide not to buy sugar and buy sugar substitutes like Splenda or Equal or all kinds of substitutes? Then it's still captured in the index, but yet fewer people are buying it. So it doesn't really account for the volume of transactions because people are walking away from it if there are substitutes, if the good in question is a substitute. So we come back to this example where they're very specific. in the makeup of the goods in the market basket, if they're saying iceberg lettuce, then it means iceberg lettuce. And so if the price of iceberg lettuce is rising, maybe people just simply buy romaine lettuce. Very similar, and but if it's price differential, price benefit, maybe people will buy that. And so as a result, we're overstating inflation because the higher priced good, people are walking away from it because of the availability of substitutes. The other is something that is of a longer term nature, and it probably would not have been discussed 20 or 30 years ago. It's something called the discount retail effect. And now that's even sort of enlarged to include the internet and one firm in particular, Amazon. And that is the idea that people have got so many more options, particularly since the scale of retail delivery, not just physical delivery to your house, but delivery to a store is so much bigger that these goods prices can come down pretty dramatically. And so you can buy a lot of goods at a lot cheaper prices at bigger stores, where smaller stores simply can't compete. And we have seen this all throughout the economy, where bigger is better, and I say that, maybe I should put that in quotes, bigger is better, only from a standpoint of cost and scale. And so you have a lot of family-owned businesses that no longer exist anymore, like pharmacies, small grocery stores, small gas stations. They just don't exist because they just can't compete on a cost basis. Because as these firms get bigger, it costs them far less to do whatever it is they do. They can pass those savings along to consumers in the form of lower prices. So as a result, the discount retail effect is bringing prices down, okay, in general. And we have had a muted amount of inflation up until just this last year, right? Whereas prices have been, we have been really talking about inflation very much. And the discount retail effect certainly was part and parcel of that. Also, Amazon, and I generally try to stay away from talking about a single company, but this is such an important one to talk about because they are so dominant now in so many areas. A company that once used to be just internet-based, where you would buy a book and they would send it to you by UPS or whatever, or FedEx. Now you buy all kinds of things on Amazon. There's almost nothing you can't buy, almost, it seems. And so as a result, at a cost, and certainly there's going to be a monetary cost or an economic cost to getting it sent to your home. So, okay. Also, the introduction of new goods. The market basket sometimes doesn't get adjusted that quickly, and so as a result, you might have an iPhone that is the latest version, but the newest version has come out, and they haven't yet included that in there. And maybe they haven't included it because it just came out, and there aren't enough sales yet to justify tracking that. But yet people are moving on to the new good and not buying as much of the old good. So as a result, new goods are coming along, replacing other goods. And by the way, this is one of the big problems with taking inflation rates over very long time periods, is because there are some goods that were in market baskets years ago that no longer even exist to be in the market basket. Things like typewriters, and liquid paper. I mean, who buys much of that anymore these days, right? They just simply exist, or mimeograph machines. Even fax machines are sort of, passe in a lot of ways. And yet these were goods that used to exist, and so no longer. So a lot of goods are just simply gone and no longer exist. And then the other issue was that I talked about was that it contained only a finite number of goods in the basket. Okay? And that gives rise to a lot of the other issues. So what are some of the problems with inflation? We're going to be coming back to this theme again that I mentioned with the unemployment piece, and that was, why should I care about inflation if I'm on a fixed income? It's mostly Social Security, and maybe it's military retirement, both of which get bumped up with the rate of inflation. Why do I care? Why does it bother me? Well, there's a reason why it should care, and that is, number one, it creates what are known as inflationary expectations. This is something that is, we're going to come back to this toward the very end of the class session, probably around week 7, where we talk about the role of expectations in general and how difficult it is for policymakers to manage expectations. And now that we've got inflationary expectations in the economy once again, the question is, if people expect something to happen, it tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we take the kinds of steps that make sure that it does happen. So if I'm a worker and I'm negotiating a wage, now I might want to negotiate for a higher wage than what I probably would have settled for otherwise. And if I couldn't get it from this employer, I'll keep moving rather than settling, because I think that prices are going to go up. So I'm going to keep trying to get a higher wage. And that higher wage then will translate to greater amounts of spending, which will contribute to the issue of inflation, generally speaking. So inflationary expectations, but also works its way into all other areas of the economy, including the supply side, where firms will try to judge what prices are going to be next year, next 2 years, or whatever, and they'll try to build price increases into them as a result, so as an expectation. Also, one of the causes of inflation is something we call demand pull, and I'll get to that here in a bit. And it's this idea that if there's excessive demand for goods, and the goods are scarce, but demand is outstripping the goods, which we've seen happen in this pandemic, right? People competing over things like paper towels and whatnot, then we're going to have a rise in the price level for those particular goods. And so as a result of this, what are we saying is happening? If you know that the good you're going to buy is going to go up in price because of that, and I'm not so much thinking about the pandemic related goods, but I'm thinking about this idea of I want to buy something as quickly as I can because the price is going to go up. I'm going to buy it now rather than wait. If I think the price of furniture is going to go up next year from where it is now, I'm going to go buy furniture now, even if I have to borrow money to do it. In fact, it makes sense to borrow money to do it if I think the price is going to be higher if I wait a year. So two benefits I can have now as opposed to waiting a year. I can get a better price now than I can a year from now. So I'm going to step up my purchase. But that unanticipated demand actually contributes to the inflationary issue in the first place, because I'm creating demand that probably wouldn't have been there otherwise, except for that expectation of a higher price. Once it gets going, it's difficult to stop. This is one of the concerns the number of economists have had. Larry Summers has been on TV a lot. He's an economist at Harvard, was former Treasury Secretary, who's talked about the idea. He's very concerned about the fact that once we get inflationary expectations built into the economy, it can become difficult to sort of dial this down if everybody expects inflation to be going up. And because once it gets going up, then workers want higher wages. And if workers don't get higher wages, they're going to be upset. And upset workers mean upset voters and all that sort of thing. So as a result, maybe there's an incentive to keep the money supply going and keep demand going, which doesn't deal with the inflation problem at all. Instead, the inflation problem keeps on going. We saw a similar instance like this happen in the 80s in Israel. Israel had a law at the time that said that if inflation is running at a certain percentage, everybody, all workers, will get an automatic increase in pay. Doesn't matter what kind of job. And then prices were going double digits, 10, 15, 20%. And people didn't really seem to care because they got compensated for that. Now they should care. Now there's a point I'll make later that says that they should care. But instead, people really didn't care. There was really no effort to deal with the inflation that was going on inside Israel. And so as a result, people just simply accepted it, and they didn't deal with the problem for many, many years because of that. So it's difficult to deal with it. Now, why should we care? Why should Israeli citizens have cared? And it's this point about the idea that incomes often don't keep pace with rising prices. And that is this. Yes, you're a Social Security recipient, you're going to give maybe a 6% bump to your compensation not till January, though. You've had to endure those price increases all year long and without any benefit of the price increase. It's after the fact. And if you're a worker and you get a wage increase, and that's even less guaranteed than Social Security, it's going to be after the fact. You've got to pay for rising gas prices out of your own pocket up front as they're happening. And only if you get an increase, in pay, it's after the fact. It's catch up, and you're always lagging because it's always, if inflation keeps on going, you're always 1 year behind. Also, there is an element of the CPI which takes out food inflation, okay, or food and energy. Takes out food and energy, which includes gasoline, electricity, and whatnot. And if we take that out, we end up with what's called core inflation. Core inflation. That's food and energy coming out. Now, why is core inflation important, and why do we account for that separately? Even though some economists have criticisms over that, why is that sometimes accounted for separately? And the answer to that is really the fact that people need to buy food and energy that they're considered necessities, but yet they're the most volatile, which is part of the problem. So sometimes economists will take out food and energy because they'll say, yeah, the CPI was up 7% last month on an annualized basis, but 5% of that was food and energy, and it's a one-time deal. It's probably not going to be recurring. It was because of higher oil prices, but oil price increases are here to stay, so it's not going to happen again, so we'll take them out. Well, the problem with that is, though, that some economists will say, yes, but you need to eat, you need to be able to drive your car and heat your house, and so go ahead and include it. So core inflation in their minds is less critical of a thing. So, but the problem though, that, and arguing too, that yes, they're volatile, so they should be included because we all have to pay for them because they're necessities. And so that's part of the problem. These goods, which are most necessity, are very volatile in terms of price. And by volatility, I simply mean subject to spikes up, spikes down in both cases for a lot of mostly supply side issues. Usually not dealing with the demand side at all in food and energy, but mostly supply side issues in almost every case. Even things like healthcare, which usually goes up in price over time, is also a necessity in most cases, and so as a result, that's also pretty volatile. Another problem with inflation, if you consider it to be a problem, is that it rewards borrowers over savers. And this is not to denigrate borrowers, because I think we're going to make the case that borrowing has got lots of valuable contributors to the economy. I mean, you know, without using borrowed money, people couldn't go to college, build houses, you know, start businesses and whatnot. So borrowed money does make a lot of sense, but if you're disadvantaged as a saver because of the presence of inflation, and then it would encourage you to borrow as opposed to save, because why save something that's depreciating in value, which is what inflation is. So think about this right now, interest rates on savings are so incredibly low that anybody who's got very much money in the savings account is really effectively in real terms losing money. Inflation adjusted, they're losing money. You might get 0.1% on the savings account right now, and inflation rates at 6%. So it's 60 times the rate of return you're getting on your money in a savings account, which is one reason why the stock market is so high, because people were saying, oh, I'm going to get any kind of value in all of my savings. I need to put it somewhere I'm going to actually get returns because interest rates are so incredibly low. And there are critics of this very low rate environment at the moment who are saying that it makes even less sense to have low interest rates in a time of inflation that we're back into. The Federal Reserve, which sets interest rates or sets the direction for interest rates, has got to act, and they're very slow and behind the curve. And I happen to think that they are very much behind. I think there's a wait and see. I understand their dilemma. They want to wait and see what happens with the supply chain issues and getting the labor force participation back to where it needs to be. A lot of people have left the labor force. They may come back, which should help the whole issue of being able to supply goods, which is another part of the double whammy that we're looking at with inflation. The inflation rate's much higher than it was anticipated. I don't think anybody saw 6% inflation happening. And even if you take out energy, which has been rising, it's still higher than what anybody, the core inflation rate is still higher than what people expected it to be. So if you're a saver right now, you're being disadvantaged. So during periods of high inflation, it might make sense to borrow, including coming back to that idea where I said that the washing machine is more expensive next year. If you expect it to be, then you buy it now. Even if you have to borrow it, you're rewarded to borrow. And by the way, by borrowing money, your text gets into this a bit, and I think it's a great point to make. It doesn't often get made. And that is the point. If you borrow money during inflationary times, and it's no matter how long it is, but it's particularly important if it's a longer term arrangement, then if inflation is rising, you're paying back with less valuable dollars over time. So it would make sense during an inflationary period to do something like buy a house. Isn't that what people have been doing? Which is why house prices in some parts of the country are just crazy high, just ridiculously high, because interest rates are low. That's been good. But also if inflation is rising and you're looking to maybe buy a house in the next few years or whatever, maybe buy it now. Lower rates, and it's only going to cost you more later than buy it now. And over 30 years, you're going to be paying that in much cheaper dollars, because presumably inflation will continue at some level, maybe not 6% annually, but you would be repaying less valuable dollars. And so it makes sense to borrow money when there's an inflationary period, because it's worth less. Okay. Okay, and that's essentially what one of the definitions of inflation are. We come back to the theme that I talked about with inflation or with unemployment. That's the idea that it affects lower income households much more than higher income households. That is, even you can net out food and energy, but food and energy accounts for a larger percentage of a lower income household's budget than it does a higher income household's budget. There's only so much food that you can consume and so much energy you can consume, and it becomes a much bigger deal to a lower income household than to a higher income household. So these volatile elements here impact lower income households much more than higher income ones, and they simply can't avoid that. Okay. higher income households may be able to avoid it through a lot of different other means. And also, and this kind of comes back to the idea of borrowing, is that dilutes the value of any fixed contract over time, because the dollar is worth less over time during an inflationary period. And so particularly if you're a lender, you may not want to engage in long-term loans because the value of the dollar is going down. And so as a result, why should I commit to lending somebody money for 30 years or 20 years or whatever? Because of the fact that those dollars I'm being repaid are less valuable. By the way, lending money is really an act of saving. In fact, if you think about who lends the money in our economy, we usually think of it as being some financial intermediary. And we'll talk about those actors here very shortly. Like a bank, what is a bank doing but channeling someone's savings? So whenever you borrow, you're actually borrowing from someone else's savings. So in an inflationary period, that saver is actually losing some of the purchasing power that he or she had, while you as the borrower are using the value of the money now for whatever the purpose is and paying back in cheaper dollars down the road. So this is one of the big criticisms that some have had about the very low interest rate environment, is it's not catching up to the inflation rate. And so as a result, savers, particularly just ordinary average savers, are forced to go places to get higher yields on their money, places that they maybe shouldn't go, like the stock market. There may be some people who are investing in stocks to get at least a dividend yield for income, but maybe they're not right for that particular area, which is one reason why the stock market is thought to be as high as it is because of that, okay? Because they can't get on passive savings. I had to look at savings bonds the other day, and I think on the rate on EE bonds was like 1/10 of 1%. And your money's locked up for a period of time. It's a crazy low rate. And you almost, the only advantage is that you don't pay state tax on it. Well, so what? You're not making the income anyway. It rounds to zero, basically. So you kind of get the idea there. Okay. All right. So this sort of some explanatory information with regard to inflation. There are two main types of inflation. Okay. There are two main types. And your text gets into these a bit, and I'll talk about what they are here. And in some ways they're different. In some ways they've got some similarities. The first of these, which is thought to be the more common, at least from a historical observational standpoint, is called demand pull inflation. It's excessive aggregate demand in relation to aggregate supply. We haven't really talked about the term aggregate demand and aggregate supply yet. That's coming up in the discussion for chapter 12. But it's simply the idea of too much demand, too many dollars chasing too few goods, right? So I'll sort of put that in quotes because this is a phrase you hear occasionally. It's too many dollars chasing too few goods. Okay, so as a result of this, you've got competition among buyers, sellers with the power and the transaction, raising prices, because if people bang down your door to buy the product you're selling, you're going to do what? You're going to raise the price, as you should. And that's a demand-induced thing. Now, by the way, we say this is the most common of the two main kinds because, historically speaking, a lot of the blame for inflation has been put on the demand side of the economy. And there is a sort of a macroeconomic school of thought called the classical school, and they're neoclassical sort of descendants who have a lot of times put the blame on government for pouring on too much demand in the economy at a time when it's not needed. And as a result, by government spending, there's inflation being caused as a result of that. Because government is not subject to the same sorts of limitations that ordinary people are. Our government can spend money pretty much at will and can fund its deficits with borrowing or with the central bank buying those borrowings, or both, and can do it on all kinds of reasons which have nothing to do with the economy whatsoever. And some of the classic example that a lot of economists will point to in criticism of the government goes back to the 1960s, in which the government was spending lots of money on things which may or may not have helped the economy directly, but things like the Vietnam War, the space program, all kinds of other things which may have more of a direct impact, like student aid, expansion of those, environmental regulations, new government bureaucracy, et cetera. All those were thought to be very much contributors to demand pull inflation, because it was government through government spending, pouring money into the economy just simply dumping and boosting the economy further than the supply side could catch up. Demand pull, that's the first kind. The second is cost push. This is one that, ironically, maybe, even though it's less common, is what we perhaps are seeing now, particularly if you believe this short-run view that says this is temporary, and that is an inflation caused by restricted supply. So right now, I think a lot of people would have no trouble believing this, the idea of restricted supply, because we've seen such issues come about, okay? In other words, we call this a supply shock. And that's what we've going on what we've seen going on right now is a lot of imports aren't making their way here. And we're seeing it in a lot of different goods that are mostly imported, but not only imported, but the ones that just can't be produced as quickly here to catch up with demand. So again, there is overlap in some respects. In both cases, there's excessive demand in relation to supply. Just of the initial cause here happens to be something that's going on that is identifiably associated with the supply side, such as a restriction in supply for whatever reason. In the 1970s, we would talk about oil shocks as being big supply shocks. That is the OPEC producing oil, OPEC countries, that is, it's an oil cartel made up of several oil producing countries were restricting supply on purpose in order to raise the price. Found out it worked beyond their wildest dreams and kept it up, and that translated to large amounts of inflation throughout the 1970s. And that supply shock and some of it became known as an oil shock, and it worked its way through the economy. Now, when we get to subsequent chapters, I'll graph these out and show what they look like graphically in terms of the overall effect, the cause and effect from demand and as well as from supply. So I'll be showing you what those look like, but they are two of the main causes of it. What's very interesting, as I've said before, is the fact that we are living in times in which we can truly point to cost push inflation, which tends to be less associated with the most common form, which is demand pull inflation. Okay, so I think that's a pretty good stopping point for here, because we'll then launch into chapter 10 and 12. Chapter 10 is a very brief chapter, but it's a very important one because it gets us into some of the basics of trying to build actual macroeconomic models, not the generic models we've been dealing with at this point, but actual true models. Okay. Okay, so what I planned on doing here within the same video was to capture some of the content from chapters 10 and 12, which go pretty quickly, I think, in a lot of ways, and then we catch us up through week 4, which was the week just ended last Thursday, and I'll probably put a separate video together, and I'll try to get as much as I can into the content that would be for the Thanksgiving Day class session, week 5, and then we'll be really in pretty good shape for the remaining bit of the course, which will deal mostly with policy and with some other different theoretical issues. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to talk in chapter 10 about the beginnings of what are known as just basic macro models, and that is the idea that we're going to try to basically lay out for you how we view things, not just in terms of individual markets, but as the economy as a whole. And so I want to come back to the income approach to calculating GDP that we looked at before. We had GDP, this is from the supply side of the economy. We had GDP, we worked our way down to national income, and these dotted lines are areas where I've cut out different categories. It's not really necessary. We work our way down to the household level. We get personal income, which is a portion of GDP earned by households prior to tax. Take out personal income taxes, we have disposable income. And from disposable income, there are only two things that a household can do with its disposable income, and that is this: it is channel it to consumption or to savings. And those are the only two categories. And we're using some pretty expansive definitions of consumption here because what we would include in consumption, because I know sometimes the question arises, as I think I mentioned in class on Thursday, was the idea of charitable giving. Where does that fit in? Well, it would be the act of consumption because it fits all the definition of that. First of all, it's not savings. And in fact, consumption differs from savings, and savings has got really two main characteristics here, and that is this. Number one, it fits the category of what we call deferred consumption, and that is that savings is assumed to someday be channeled toward spending on final goods. To the extent that someone is saving, it means they're not generating that toward the consumption of final goods. Even if it might be loaned out to somebody else, it still comes back to them in the form of savings. And so to the saver, it's still savings. And then also it has to do with the fact that savings tends to be deposited in the financial system. Okay, so it tends to be deposited with financial intermediaries, and banks obviously meet the criteria. I mean, this is often low on board here. Financial intermediaries like banks, credit unions, investment firms, insurance companies, you name it, okay? So it tends to be deposited with financial intermediaries. And so those two characteristics make charitable giving an act of consumption, because if you give money to the Salvation Army or to the United Way, it tends to be spent fairly quickly, does not tend to be deposited for very long periods of time, and the consumption that it's generating is not deferred. It's usually channeled fairly quickly into spending. So what isn't consumption then is savings at the household level. Forget about, and by the way, investment, which we have its own separate category in the expenditures approach. And I have you now probably been exposed to this now several times, both in the text as well as from me, and that is investment is business investment, financial investment, which a lot of times we would think of as belonging under savings, is really a form of savings and not investment in the capital I that we use in macroeconomics, okay? And that, so if you deposit with a brokerage firm or investment firm or whatever, that is still an act of savings, okay? So what about this? How do we talk about consumption and how do we talk about savings? Well, first of all, we can say there's a mathematical complements. So C&S are mathematical complements, meaning basically this. If you take this basic formula, disposable income equals consumption plus savings, and you have disposable income of 1,000, okay? Just keep the numbers simple here. And you have consumption of $900, then savings must be $100. There can't be anything but that. So in other words, this consumer would have $1,000 of income, would spend 900, save 100, okay? Or if the person's a bigger saver, maybe that person, if he only spends 800, then it must mean that that person saves a larger amount. So, but they both fold into the same dollar figure of disposable income. They are complements to one another. And having said that, even if you have a case in which you have somebody who earns $1,000 and spends $1,200, then, okay, well, how do we get to 1,000? Well, it must mean that we have to subtract 200. So plus negative 200 plus a negative is a minus. And so as a result, 1,200 minus 200 is 1,000. And so in this case, it is possible to spend more than what somebody takes home in the form of disposable income. It happens all the time. Whenever you buy a house, for instance, you're engaging this particular kind of behavior that we simply refer to as negative savings. And it sounds like that's a real derogatory term. It is not. In fact, the more useful term is something called dis-savings. And every time you spend more than what you take in, you must be drawing somewhere on someone else's savings, even if it's your own. So you get $1,000 that goes to your checking account that had a zero balance before, now it's 1,000, but you spend $200 more than your pay. You must have funded that somehow. And it could be funded through borrowing or through someone else's, your savings, right? So how is this savings funded, right? It's either funded by borrowing or savings. But really, it's the same thing, because if you're borrowing from someone else's savings, even if it's your own. Even if it's your own. And by the way, a lot of people, I would imagine, probably move money from savings to checking in order to pay these extraordinary expenses or major purchases or whatever. Not that $200 is a major purchase, but it's the idea. And expect it to be a short-term thing, that they're only borrowing money from savings, we tend to move it back. And in fact, they probably, a lot of them do. Some of them probably don't, but nonetheless, some of them don't repay borrowings from banks either. So you get the idea, not all borrowings are actually repaid. That's a whole other issue in its own right, but that's how this savings is financed. So what about consumption? What about savings? What can we say about the entire macroeconomy? We can look at our individual circumstances and know sort of where we stand in terms of this. But I want to sort of introduce this by first talking about something called propensities. And if you consider what this definition is of propensities, the dictionary would have this as a leaning or a tendency. A tendency or a leaning, and that is you have this sort of natural, almost innate tendency to do something if something happens. if you pull a dog's tail, that dog has a tendency to bite you, right? Not because the dog goes through a giant thought process, but because he or she is sort of programmed to do that. And the same goes to some respects, even though I hate to use that particular analogy on ordinary people, but people do tend to lock in certain behaviors, and then they are sort of locked into it because of their innate natural things that they do. And that is, one of the things they do is spend, and the other thing they do is save when it comes to the ordinary consumer. So there's something called the average propensity to consume. The average propensity to consume is basically taking, on average, what do consumers spend versus what do they earn, okay? So it's consumption over disposable income, and so we end up with an average. And likewise, people can take the average propensity to save, which is simply savings divided by disposable income. Okay? Disposable income being the same value in both cases here. Okay? Disposable income is the same in both cases. So what about the case in which, let's go back to the first case, this example here, where you had income, well, let's say it's $1,000 is for the entire economy. So $1,000, and the economy is spending 900 of that. Well, 900 divided by 1,000. Now this translates then to a percentage or a decimal, where you get 0.9 or 90%, right? And I prefer to keep this as decimal just because, you know, it sort of matches a little bit. I mean, we can multiply it by 100 and then call it, you know, 90 if you want. But I mean, it's, you know, it's the same thing. And so I think we should get used to sort of looking at it in this particular way. So that means that if for the same $1,000 of disposable income, $100 must be channeled towards savings. And so 100 divided by 1,000 is 0.1. Let me make sure that the camera's picking this up here. It looks like it is, okay. As faintly as it's kind of over to the side there. Well, both these together, if they're mathematical, if savings and consumption are mathematical complements, and so are these, and so they either add up to 1, or if you again multiply that by 100 to move the decimal 2 points to the right, you get 100%. So all of the disposable income is accounted for in either for the entire economy in terms of consumption or savings. But this is for the entire economy, okay? Here's the problem, and the problem lies with the term average. And the term average is a little bit problematic from our standpoint, because why? Because what does average really say about anybody, right? If the average family has 2.3 children, well, that doesn't make any sense, right? There's no family with 0.3 of a child. Or if you take an average, it's also, averages are also skewed by very large data sets that might throw things off. And so very often when we have outliers and sets of data, we just throw out these outliers because they were really going to mess up the average. So as a result, average is just simply taking everybody together and arriving at something average. And it doesn't maybe say anything about any individual randomly chosen observation. I had it also may not mean anything whatsoever, right? I had a professor when I was in graduate school who talked about averages and said, the problem with averages is that if you consider average to be okay and satisfactory, then if you have an ice pack on your head and your feet in boiling water, then on average, you should be comfortable. So you get the idea of these extreme conditions make the average problematic. So as a result, it's difficult. And the other thing too is the fact that disposable income is wildly distributed. So what does it say about an average consumer? It doesn't say very much, does it? Because here's the reality when it comes to consumption and savings, and that is, first of all, something called the consumption function, which we're going to graph here in just a second. And the reality of it is this, and there are two realities, both of which tie into one another, and that is that consumers spend a higher percentage, a higher percentage of a lower disposable income and a lower percentage of a higher disposable income. And if you think about it, this makes sense. If you're of a fairly low income, you're going to spend, your income is fairly low, maybe you're at or near the poverty level, which is defined as what is it defined as? As a household budget, number of people in the household times the average, twice the average dietary intake. U.S. Department of Agriculture actually defines what the poverty level is. Obviously twice the food amount, which the rest go into other things, which is problematic in its own right because it counts people 65 and over a little bit less because they get government assistance through Medicare and whatnot. Anyway, I don't want to belabor that point. All I'm simply saying is if you have a low income, you're going to probably spend most of that income. So a higher percentage of disposable income is going to be spent. You simply don't have income to save. And we see this happening a lot. In fact, you may end up borrowing, going into negative savings in order to finance purchases that you didn't have the savings on your own right to pay for, or the income coming in to be able to fund that sort of as a routine expense. So as a result, we know that lower income households spend a higher percentage of their income, and the same is the opposite case with a higher income household that spends a lesser percentage of its consumption, thereby channeling some of it to savings. As a result of this, then if the two are complements, then these two statements should fold together, and that is that a lower disposable income household has a lower percentage of savings. It's the same thing as higher consumption. Higher consumption implies lower savings, and the same goes with a higher income household has a higher savings versus with a higher income. Okay, so those are how those two are related. Now, if we were to graph these, what do they look like here? If we plot, and I'm going to have to erase some of this here because I've only got a little bit of board space to work with. I'm going to plot on both axes here on two graphs with one common axis. That's the disposable income axis. We got three variables with only two axes, and so I have to include a separate graph. There's no way to do it unless I include a third axis, which is really hard to see. So let's go with disposable income on the horizontal in both cases, and we're going to plot consumption and savings together. And so we have something we call the consumption function. We're going to say that it starts somewhere at zero disposable income here. There is some spending going on. There is some spending going on here. That is, if somebody has zero income, and again, this is the macroeconomy, that there is spending going on that is not independent of income. We're going to call this autonomous expenditures. And that is C that's independent of DI. And in other words, then how is that financed? Well, I'll come back to that in a second. C that is independent of DI. So in other words, you got this amount here, even at zero income, there is spending going on. But as the income rises, we would expect consumption to rise. And so the consumption function looks something like that. It's often plotted, and I know your text, it'll be plotted as a sort of a linear kind of function. In reality, it's probably got more curve to it, kind of bends concave downward, but for our purposes, to make it easier, we'll use a straight line. So what about consumption? What about this entire range here in which you've got consumption greater than savings? Oh, by the way, I didn't mention, I should have at the outset. Essentially, the origin of going to bisecting both of these. This dashed line, excuse me, this dashed line is called the line of equality. And it's used a lot in graphing, any kind of application in which you're taking two variables and you want to say what is the midpoint. Well, anything that falls on that that line of equality means the same equivalent values are being reflected on either axis if they're both denominated in the same thing. Now, if we've got a percentage here and a dollar here, that wouldn't make any sense, but we've got consumption, which is a dollar figure, right? And we got disposable income, which is a dollar figure. So it's apples and apples, okay? It's an apples and apples sort of combination. So as a result of this 45-degree line, the line of equality. If it falls on it, it means that for every amount of disposable income, we've got an equal amount of consumption. Well, that's not the case here because we've got consumption greater than disposable income, consumption greater than disposable income, consumption greater than disposable income. And so what do we got going on here in this particular case? Where consumption is greater than disposable income, and I erased it here because I needed the board space. But this is an element of what is known as dis saving, right? If you're spending more than what you're earning, then this entire shaded region, in fact, is made up of dis saving. So that sort of triangular wedge there is dis saving. It's spending in excess of disposable income simply because of the fact that there is borrowing going on. And it's not always restricted to the lower income households, but higher income households tend to be net savers as opposed to net borrowers. That's why they have a high net worth. And net simply means you're taking out, you have a net worth would take out all of your liabilities, that you are more of a saver than a borrower. Okay. There are exceptions. There are some very high income households that are high borrowers as well. They have very little net worth. They are sort of outliers in this whole scenario. So when consumption exceeds disposable income, we say there's dis saving going on. At this point here, where consumption equals disposable income, it falls right on the line of equality, right? So they must be equivalent to one another, and that there is zero savings. There's also zero savings or zero dissavings. So there's zero savings and zero dissavings. Sometimes it's called dissaving or savings, either way, it doesn't matter. And here, in this case, where consumption is less than disposable income, consumption is less than disposable income all along that area there. For this shade around here, where there is more disposable income than there is savings, we simply refer to that as savings. Okay? So that region there is savings. Okay, so that's the way the consumption function looks in terms of its relationship to disposable income, having been a derivative of the income approach to computing GDP. That is taking into account, this is ordinary household spending. And what we're doing here is we're sort of beginning the building blocks of a model that we'll then use to expand to include other models and other concepts that are really unique to macro that will hopefully allow us to understand macro a little bit more concretely as to what all is happening, okay? So that's the consumption function. What about the savings function? Well, think about this. If you've got a case in which consumption equals savings, that is, there's zero savings, then it must be at that income level, that disposable income level, we must have an intercept there, right? And we do. And if this savings is also known as negative savings, then wouldn't this savings value then fall below the line here? In other words, being negative. Remember, everything below the origin on the vertical axis is negative, and those are negative values. Anything above this, where there's positive, means we have a positive amount of savings. And so the savings function looks something like that. And the exact amount of area that's covered under this wedge of dissavings is the same for the negative savings or dissavings here. The same area there is the same as it is here, because again, they're mathematically complement. They must fold into each other to form 1.0. That is the whole. They must fold in together to meet that characteristic. So the savings function, which looks a little bit flatter, and there's a reason for that, and I'll get to that here in just a minute. But that is essentially what's going on there. And I know your book gets into a bit about what happens if consumption shifts upward or shifts downward. And I mean, that's probably a little bit advanced for what we want to do here. You know, it could happen for a lot of different reasons, like tax policy, you know, exchange value, exchange rates, things like that. We're not really that concerned with that whole thing right now. Okay. So again, consumption being greater than disposable income. So this is just savings here and savings down here. Okay. Okay, so what about this? All right, well, all right, so we're making the case here that we've got a problem with the average. That's the problem of the ice pack on the head, the feet in boiling water. And what does it say about average household when you've got disposable incomes all over the place here, and then different amounts of propensity, different kinds of propensities, given the fact that different income levels of households differ in the way that they choose to allocate their disposable income, either to consumption or to savings. What does it say? What can we do about it? Well, then we have to talk about this. And furthermore, what does it mean if we're trying to enact a policy in order to change disposable income? And by the way, we have been witness to this just in the last couple of years. The government has done all kinds of things in order to change our behavior as to what to do with disposable income. In other words, giving us essentially free money in the form of stimulus checks, increased unemployment benefits, increased food assistance. These are all bumps to what would ordinarily be there anyway. Sort of a longer time period to those particular benefits in some cases, all in order to boost disposable income, in order to boost consumption, because consumption, as we see, will translate immediately to demand, whereas savings is a little bit less, contributes a little bit less to demand and to GDP in that direction. So the federal government would have liked it if we took all the money that we got in the form of stimulus and spent it. And but that didn't happen in every case. In some cases it did, obviously, but it didn't happen in every case. So, and because of that, the effect of that has been somewhat muted. In fact, they tried their best because they sort of cut off the higher income households from the stimulus, saying you don't need it. So if you had somebody who got a pretty high income, they probably didn't get any stimulus at all, and as a result, they were sort of out of luck when it came to that. Okay, all right. So there is a problem with taking averages. And what does that mean? It means that we can't really rely upon any individual consumer to do a particular thing because of the fact that some are going to spend, some are going to save, some are going to spend more, some are going to save more. So what can we say about the average household? Maybe we don't care about the average household. And what I mean by that is maybe we're more interested in saying, what will the economy do overall, given that it's a very diverse place with different income levels, different individual propensities to save and consume, given the fact that it's a much higher propensity to consume with a lower income household, much lower propensity to consume with a higher income household. Is there a way that we can sort of measure that in a way that doesn't necessarily get us bogged down with individual changes? And so instead we look at something called the marginal propensity to consume. The marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save. And so we're basically saying what will happen as a what if we change disposable income for the entire economy. We don't need to necessarily worry that high income households will do this, low income households will do this. If we have a pretty good idea of what these values would tend to be, that is, if we change disposable income around by $5,000 for every household, what would they do with that? On average, not being concerned that it's, actually I shouldn't say on average, or as an entire macro economy. So we end up with a marginal propensity to consume, which is similar to this, but it's different. It's saying what will change if we change disposable income. So if we have, it's the change in consumption divided by the change in disposable income. And then we have the marginal propensity to save, which is the change in savings divided by the change in disposable income. And so if we end, and so again, the delta, the Greek triangle there, the Greek delta symbol represents change. And so if we raise the level by, let's say $1,000, and we know of that a household is going to, that most households on average are going to spend $950 of that, then we know that we've got 950 divided by 1,000 is 0.95, meaning that by definition, $1,000 is the same change in disposable income, whether through a tax cut or a stimulus check or whatever, then we know it's got to be 50 because they have to add up to one another. Consumption, savings, or complements. So we end up with 0.05. Together, they sum to 1.00 or 1, which is the whole. Again, if you wanted to multiply it by 100, you would get 100% if you wanted to look at it that way. So MPC plus MPS are also mathematical complements because they both track, they both fold into one another. They have to equal each other, okay? And this is going to be something positive because even though, yes, there is just savings going on, there are still lots of savings happening throughout the economy. And the government understands that there are going to be households that are going to get a stimulus check that are just going to put it in the bank and not spend it, okay? I think there are probably a lot of households that did that. And because they had really no way of differentiating who was in need, and they tried their best by cutting out the obvious people who didn't need it, those earning over, say, $400,000 a year if it was a married filing joint, and it was based upon tax data. They probably didn't need the $1,200 or the $2,400 or whatever as much as a lower income household for sure. But nonetheless, it doesn't make any difference because they had a pretty good idea of what is going to happen once those dollars start arriving, and it's most of it being channeled toward consumption, most of it being channeled toward savings. And this can't be negative because it wouldn't make sense. There's always going to be some savings happening. Okay. No, I'm sorry, this can never be negative. There's always got to be some savings happening. So what can we say about this then? Well, one thing that is interesting about this is, look at what this looks like. The change in consumption, the change in disposable income. In other words, it's the change in the vertical divided by the change in the horizontal. It's the change in the vertical divided by the change in the horizontal. Well, what does that look like to you? That looks like the slope to me, doesn't it? So delta C divided by delta DI is the slope of the consumption function. It is the slope of the consumption function. And the same goes with the rise over run here. Oops, that should be a straight line. I didn't do that very well, did I? So it's the delta S over the delta I, rise over run. It is the slope of the savings function. Okay, slope of the savings function. Oops. So you get the idea here that the slopes together then should sum to the whole. So the slope of the savings function, the slope of the consumption function together. So that's what's interesting. And so think about this. If most of it goes toward consumption, and it's kind of hard to do this where you get a really steep slope for consumption I tried to make savings as flat as I could. It's a very low slope. 0.05 is a much smaller slope than it's 0.95, but you kind of get the idea. The book does a better job of doing it than what I'm able to do on the board, but I also wanted to make some room here so that I could put some could enter some information there. Okay, so those together are interesting. Now, all right, so who cares, right? What about this? What do we do with this, and what's the purpose of it? If we know the MPC throughout the economy, then we know what the economy is going to do roughly, then what is it that we are going to do with that information? In other words, what is our expectation based upon what the amount of change in disposable income is? Because we can, if we're policymakers, we can control the amount of disposable income that is changed through lower taxes, higher stimulus, whatever, increased unemployment, increased food assistance, whatever. But we don't know for sure what's going to go on with consumption savings, but we can estimate it. And if we estimate it, then we can know what the effect is going to be on the economy. And that leads us to something called the multiplier. And I'm going to go ahead and erase this graph because I think we probably don't need it now as much as we did. So I guess that's the good thing about using recordings here. So the multiplier, and this is what's called the consumption multiplier, only for right now, it's the only multiplier we will have been exposed to. There are all kinds of multipliers throughout macroeconomics. There's a investment multiplier, there's a tax multiplier, there's all kinds of multipliers. This is right now, this is the multiplier on consumption. Multiplier on consumption. And so what is it? Well, think about this. If we're talking about, in other words, multiplier is simply the idea of taking something and exaggerating its importance because it has ripple effects. It doesn't just stop. It's like throwing a rock into a still lake. It doesn't just go straight down with leaving no ripple. It ripples out, but yet it gets weaker as it goes further from the source of the initial ripple. That's what a multiplier effect does. It gets weaker over time, but it radiates and it covers a bigger surface area, has a bigger impact than the initial change, the initial stimulus, in other words. That's why it's called stimulus. So what we're trying to do is stimulate the economy in order to let the economy do its own thing. And the multiplier itself, this value of the multiplier, is simply equal to the reciprocal of the savings rate, the marginal propensity to save. So it's 1 over MPS. And since, well, and I guess if you go back to the other formula here, the MPC plus MPS, which is this formula over here, well, I'm going to write it sort of horizontally here. If MPC plus MPS equals 1.0, which we know they do, this is the same thing as saying is 1 over 1 minus the MPC. It's just whatever is easiest for you, depending on what data you have. But I think it's useful to think of it very simply as being the reciprocal of the savings rate. And in fact, isn't that what consumption is the reciprocal of savings? Taking whatever change in your income is and converting some of it to consumption because it's the reciprocal of savings. It's the opposite of savings, in other words. It's on the opposite side of the equation here, or the opposite side of the division problem. So that's essentially what's going on. So think about this. The multiplier then is that factor that multiplies some change in the economy by something. So let's say that we have let's say that we go and let me change these values a little bit. Let's say that we have an MPC, just to make the math a little bit easier here, of 0.8. And this is just to sort of make our math a little easier. I'm going to make this 800 and I'll make this 200. So 800, which is 0.8, and then 200 goes to savings, 0.2. Together they equal 100% or 1. So what about this? What is 1 over the MPS? 1 over the MPS is 1 over 0.2, which is 5. Okay. Now, what if we were to say, okay, well, if there's a change in disposable income of $1,000, then the change in overall spending is 5 times the change in initial consumption. Okay. Okay. Then the change is the multiplier times the amount. Multiplier times the stimulus amount. Okay. So in other words, if the multiplier is 5, and this is 1,000, then we have 5,000 once it goes through its progressions, because it doesn't just stop with you getting $1,000 or the economy getting $1,000. Let's say that translates to, if there's 100 households, it's $10 to you, and you spend it, and then that means somebody else has now got more income to spend because it was unexpected. It's just money that came from the sky. And then they spend some of it, but not all of it. They spend some of it, but not all of it. And then that person spends some of it, but not all of it. So it gets smaller and smaller in dollar terms, even though it's that same relative constant of 0.8 of consumption. If we believe that multiplier is around 5, which is not quite that high. There's a great example in your book on page 210 of how these rounds take place. They're theoretical, but they are in fact what has to happen throughout the economy when there is a stimulus, that it doesn't just stop when one party buys something. So if you got a $1,200 stimulus check, then you spent 1,000 of it at Walmart, and then Walmart then had more money to go buy more inventory, hiring more labor all the time that was happening, which then increased their purchasing power. They had more sales, and so as a result of more sales, they were able to buy more goods from manufacturers who were in turn able to employ more labor. You get the idea how this thing can work on itself. So the change in disposable income is that. In other words, it's the change in GDP is equal to 5 times the multiplier times the change in disposable income. And so the change in GDP is $5,000 with only $1,000 worth of stimulus. And that's just the consumption multiplier. That's just taking into account what households have been doing. This doesn't include any kind of stimulus that might affect businesses or whatever. And that would be sort of muddying the waters and kind of complicate things. But even though, keeping in mind that there are more multipliers than just this one. Okay, and to kind of play with some more numbers here, what if we did this? What if we just said, okay, let's just change some of the numbers around and see as a what if, what would that do to, assuming the MPC is changing, because let's work under some different assumptions here. The MPC is not quite what we thought it was, then maybe it's actually turns out to be higher. Let's go to a 0.9 MPC, which means a 0.1 MPS. And so as a result, what do we have here? So out of the original 1,000 of stimulus, 90% now is spent and 10% is saved. And so as a result, we still end up a sum to 100%. But now what do we got going on here? We've got a different MPS. So now we've got 1 divided by 0.9. I'm sorry, 1 divided by 0.1, which is not 5, but is 10. So now you've got 10 times the initial 1,000. So the change in GDP is now 10,000, not 5,000. And so as a result, you've got a much bigger bang for the buck in terms of change in GDP than what you had with just that $1,000. And with a flatter consumption curve. So what can we say about it is this, that the higher the multiplier is higher, right? The higher the multiplier, the higher the change in GDP. Okay, the higher the multiplier, the higher the change in GDP. Okay, which we'll call delta Y. So the higher the multiplier, the higher the change in GDP. And this is a reality of dealing essentially with what are some of the facts of dealing with propensities. And think about this too. What if we had, what if $1,000 that we gave throughout the economy and say it was 50% MPC and 50% MPS, and then we only have a multiplier of 2, which would only give us, out of $1,000, only give us 2,000 of change in GDP, as opposed to 10,000, which is a much higher change in GDP. Then what can we say about that? That savings ends up being a drag on the economy. So in other words, when we talk about savings is what we call leakage. And you might run into some of that language in the textbook. This idea that if the more people save, then it actually slows the economy down. And I know this sort of goes against what a lot of us are maybe sort of conditioned to believe about savings, that savings is good, that's a great thing. But what it does do, and it is, but what it does do is it cuts off the income and spending cycle. And so if everyone saved everything that they made, the economy would slow down. So think about this. What if we had this hypothetical closed economy of just Albuquerque and nothing came in, nothing left, and everyone decided for whatever reason, like it would never happen, but what if, right? no one was going to spend money for a week. And so, we were going to, eat tree bark and cats and whatnot and not drive. Well, the economy would absolutely collapse just within a very short period of time. And what if it wasn't a week? What if it was a month or a year or whatever? And by the way, that is not such an unusual circumstance when like a city is under siege and whatnot. There's just no consumption going on. So there's no local economy. In fact, the economy has failed in that particular case, right? So there's no consumption. And so as a result of this, there's nothing that can be done about boosting the economy. There's no consumption happening. Likewise, one of the reasons why during the Great Depression that there were a lot of banking laws put into place, including the enactment of deposit insurance, because of the fact that people, if they got any kind of savings at all, they would bury it in their backyard or put it under their mattress or whatnot because they didn't trust banks. Until people got used to the idea that the government would bail out a bank that failed, up to a certain amount, you would get your deposits back, and it's a pretty high dollar figure. It's mostly 200,000. Mostly was 100,000 for a time. That's a pretty good amount just for a bank deposit. And so that encouraged people to come back to banks because they were really worried that people would take that money out of circulation. It wouldn't make its way back into consumption. And what's more, it wouldn't even make its way back into lending because it wouldn't be part of that characteristic of savings that we call deposit with financial intermediaries. We want people to participate in the financial system, and that's why there's so much regulation of it. And that's coming up very soon as we progress to the next area. So anyway, that does it for what I wanted to talk about with regard to chapter 10. Again, as I indicated, it's not a particularly long chapter, and neither really is the next one, aggregate demand and aggregate supply. I think I'll cut this particular video off because I think it's long enough. And then I'll try to get into, depending upon the good graces, staying in good graces with security here, if they'll let me stay and record the material for this particular week, chapter 5. That was to fall on Thanksgiving Day. What I don't get done is going to be easily covered next Thursday, assuming we don't have any more mishaps and whatnot. We think we've got that figured out. At least we hope. So anyway, I'll come in. I'll start your aggregate supply here in just a second. Okay, so to get us involved in chapter 12 here, which deals with aggregate demand and aggregate supply, I just want to sort of recap a little bit about where we have sort of come from with regard to, let's just take demand first. And remember we talked about the basic micro model, the basic market model, which is really a micro model. If we consider microeconomics to be simply the market for individual, or the study of individual markets, then this ties in very closely with what the PQ plan is all about. We've got a downward sloping demand curve, and we've got the price of the good. One of the good in question is shoes, frying pans, whatever, and the quantity of the good on that axis. And so this is what we are now used to seeing. Well, the macro model of this is very similar to this in the sense that we also end up with a downward sloping curve, but we're talking now about all goods and services throughout the economy. So now we're going to simply refer to that as aggregate demand. Aggregate meaning the demand for all goods and services throughout the economy. Okay. And so it's all good. And the same goes with aggregate supply. We'll get to that in a second. What's a little bit different here is, number one, aggregate demand is just a bit different than demand and micro conception because it's downward sloping for reasons we talked about, basically having to do with the law of demand. It's the similar idea here with the law of demand. The law of demand is not outlawed, even though we're taking out all markets for all goods in an aggregate demand model, but we're adding a couple of different things, all of which basically relate to this guy right here, and that is the P, which is not the same P over there at all. Instead, this is the price level. And this is the price level based on whatever the index value is at a particular point in time. So it's the price level, because remember, when we talk about macro, we're talking about the price level for all goods, not just the market for any specific good or the price of any specific good. We're talking about all goods and the aggregate demand for all goods and the price level for all goods, essentially. Well, how do we decide on the price level? We obviously use these indexes that sort of capture that. And instead of the quantity of goods, we take the dollar value of goods, and that is we take GDP. So we have the micro model as a PY plane. It's usually real GDP, although sometimes you might see it in nominal terms. And by the way, when inflation is very slight, as it really has been the last several years, the difference between nominal and real in any particular year is very small. It's beginning to be bigger now, so we may be making a bigger and a more important distinction between real and nominal wise we go forward here, just given that particularly if we can't get the inflation issue under control anytime soon. Okay. So let's talk about aggregate demand, then we'll get into aggregate supply a little bit later here, and then that will finish up this business and will bring us current through week 4, and then we'll get into some of the content that we would have covered on Thanksgiving. So what about aggregate demand is downward? So why is it downward sloping? And you'd be tempted to think, well, it's downward sloping because what else would you expect it to be? It's a demand curve, right? You've got P on the vertical axis. What would you expect it to be with downward sloping? Okay, that's not a bad answer, but there are some other things that are included in that, added to the simple law of demand. And among those are something called the real balances effect as one of those causes for why it's downward sloping. And the real balances of what? It's the real balances of money. And that is, if in fact, it has to do with purchasing power and how far purchasing power will go. If the price level is lower, it adds up to more purchasing power, and so we're able to demand more GDP as a result of that. If the price level is rising, we're able to demand less GDP. And so as a result, the real balances effect is the real balances of money. The key term here being real. And what is the real effect of the economy? Okay, so that's one of the additional reasons here. Again, a lot of it tied to this vertical axis. The second is called the interest rate effect, and it's very similar to the first effect. The three that are sort of the causes of the downward slope are all sort of related. The interest rate effect basically says that the price level is rising. It's also going to cause interest rates to rise as well, because interest rates, even though we haven't talked very much about them at all, are really the prices of a certain type. Again, that's the price of money. In fact, we define the interest rate as being the rental cost of money expressed as an annual percentage rate. So if the price level is rising, means there's inflation happening. Interest rates will usually rise as a result because people know that dollars are depreciating in value. And if you're a saver or a lender, you want to try to mitigate that effect by earning a higher rate of return on those dollars, because they're coming back to you in smaller dollar per dollar value. Okay, so the interest rate effect is the same way. And the same goes to the last one called the foreign purchases effect. And that is, if our inflation rate is rising, we'll buy fewer domestic goods. Remember, Y stands for GDP. If the price of US-made automobiles is expensive relative to foreign-made automobiles, we'll buy less US-made automobiles, thereby depressing GDP, and buy more foreign-made automobiles, simply because the price of our output is more expensive relative to other countries. So that's the cause, in addition to the generalized law of demand, as to why aggregate demand is a downward sloping curve. And just like changes in aggregate demand, where let's say that it's associated with some price level. So let's say that at some base level of 100, okay, we've got some GDP we'll simply call Y sub 0. If something were to change where the original GDP, which we'll call, or the original aggregate demand, which we'll call AD sub 0, changes and shifts to the right to 81. In other words, what we're simply saying is, if at the same price level, we're going to be demanding more output. Okay? So more of the output is taken up by some change in GDP, or some change in aggregate demand, which then causes a change in GDP. GDP reacts to the change in aggregate demand. And this is so just like in the model of the micro model, where a rightward shift is an increase away from the origin. Well, it's the same basic graph. You're moving away from the origin. It's a rightward shift, so it's an increase. And so again, I know I've said this a number of times, think right, left, not up and down. And it'll sort of explain what's going on here. Even though with a downward sloping curve, it does tend to go up. With a downward sloping curve, that left is going to tend to look like it's going up, where it's actually going down to the left. That's just the dynamics of this, okay? So those shifts can come from all kinds of different things, right? So what are the causes of the change in shifts, right? That can cause, remember, when we said that the demand curve could shift to the right or to the left, right? So the same case goes here. If we have a leftward shift, aggregate demand goes to 82, which then at the same price level, which represents a decrease. So the same price level, now we've got Y2. And in other words, less aggregate demand is being demanded, or less GDP is being demanded for the same price level. Then what could cause these shifts? Remember, we said the demand curve in this basic model could be caused by changes in non-price variables like taste and preferences, incomes, availability of substitutes, all those kinds of things. What can cause changes in aggregate demand, right? Well, changes in aggregate demand can come about through all kinds of things. Number one, it could be a change in the overlying pattern of consumption, right? So, and what are we really talking about here? So it could be due to things like change in disposable income, maybe a change in taxes, change in income, change in expectations. Could be all kinds of, could be even something like a change in life expectancy, could be that. It could also be a change in investment. So maybe you see where we're going now with this. And that could be things due to things like changes in interest rates, changes in tax policy, changes in business forecasts and business outlook. Could be due to changes in currencies, currency valuation, which we don't really get into in this class, but suffice it to say that currency valuations do sometimes affect business decisions, all those kinds of things. One that's less explicable, but is significant at times, is change in government spending. So C and I and G. So for those of you who are thinking back to the expenditures model of C plus I plus G, all these can have an impact, just like the one which is now the most obvious, a change in net exports or any kind of change in that difference between exports and imports. All that can happen, and that could very easily be due to things like currency fluctuation. Again, a change in the value of one currency in relation to the other. And why that happens is a bit beyond where I think we want to go in this class, but it's very often responsible for a change in net exports. And there have been cases which some countries have tried to sort of manipulate their currency value. The British were sort of called out on that by some countries who are trying to push down the value of the British pound. You would think, why would they do that? Well, it would make British goods less expensive to foreign buyers. And so as a result, they would be able to export more. Well, why does everybody do that? Why does everybody devalue their currency then, right? Well, then it could be inflationary, because what is one of the definitions of inflation? A devaluation, a depreciation of the value of the currency. So you've got to be a bit careful how you do it. I know that China has been accused of that sort of manipulation, although in recent years, I think there's less evidence that China's been engaging in it. I know President Trump has long, when he was president, was long on the case of accusing China of manipulating its currency. It's probably the Chinese government sort of understood that it needs to not do too much of that, because that can actually backfire. But that's one way that net exports can change, is to change in the fluctuations. There are all kinds of other issues that can affect things like warfare, tend to slow down international trade. Those are all particular elements that could be impactful. Okay. All right. So there's the issue with the demand side. What about the supply side? Well, we know that in the basic market model, we have supply being upward sloping, right? No big whoop there. We understand that. And so what do we got going on here when we talk about supply? We've got the same PY plane happening, right? And I'm going to erase most of this. It'd be easier to work with a new one here. So we got the same PY elements. And by the way, they're going to be on the same sort of field of battle here. And so we've got an upward sloping curve that we're simply going to refer to as not as supply, but as aggregate supply. So it's going to be upward sloping. But we're going to make one caveat here, and it's going to be one that we're going to sort of expand into describing the reasons for this difference. And we're going to differentiate, unlike demand, which we don't do, we're going to call this the short run aggregate supply curve, because we're going to make the distinction between the short run aggregate supply and the long run aggregate supply. It has to do with a particular bit of thinking about how aggregate supply behaves in the long run in relation to inflation in particular, price level changes. And so that's going to be coming up, and we'll get into that probably around week 6 or even maybe week 7, because it's really sort of the elements where we're trying toward the very end of the class to sort of bring everything together, particularly in order to form a sort of a cogent analysis of where macroeconomics stands at the moment in terms of theory, understanding of the way economies work and whatnot. And I think a lot can be said for the fact that there's a lot more understood about economies now, certainly than what was the case in the 1930s. We would have probably had a depression beginning in 2008 had we not understood more about the macroeconomy. And we would almost certainly be in one now with the pandemic, were it not for some of the prescriptive measures that were taken in the wake of the coronavirus epidemic. So it's upward sloping, okay? So why is it upward sloping? Well, it's upward sloping for reasons like the law of supply. And that's the relationship between price level and firms' willingness and ability to supply output. And as the price level goes up, firms are more willing to supply output. Why wouldn't you? If whatever you're producing is going up for a higher price, you'll supply more of it. If the prices are falling, you'll supply less of it. That's simple supply side economics as far as that goes. It's considered to be vertical in the long run, and I'll come back to that here a little bit later, and I'll actually walk through what the derivation is, what are the steps involved, what are the causes of a shift between the short run and the long run, where the long run aggregate supply actually appears to be vertical. And not everyone necessarily agrees with it, so I'll sort of make the case that it's going to be somewhat theoretical, okay? Well, just like in the case of aggregate demand, where if you have some initial price level, we'll call it 100, and you have some initial aggregate supply, we'll call ASSR 0. Well, there could be a change now where you have a rightward shift in aggregate supply. And again, think right, left, not up, down, because this looks like a decrease, but it's actually an increase. So ASSR 1. So for the same price level, more quantities being supplied. And it's not due to the price. Remember, it's due to a non-price variable. In this case, a non-price level variable. We'll talk about what some of those are in just a second here. A leftward shift, on the other hand, to ASSR 2 is going to be a leftward shift. Again, don't think about it up, down, but think about a decrease, right, left. And so what can these be due to? What are the changes in aggregate supply due to? We know the movements along are due to changes in the price level. That's been pretty obvious. But what are those changes due to? Well, in the case of aggregate demand, it was pretty easy, because all we did was simply dismantle what aggregate demand is, that is the components. Remember, from the expenditures approach, which we already defined previously as being the demand side of the economy, well, an aggregate demand must be composed of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. But what about aggregate supply? And we sort of go back to some of what we knew from chapter 3, dealing with individual markets. What can cause these changes? And we'll talk about this, and one of the biggies here is a change in inputs. In particular, the change in input costs. And if costs are rising, aggregate supply tends to shift to the left. And if they're falling, aggregate supply tends to shift to the right. Shift left and shift right. So in other words, one's up, one's down. Left, right is how we like to sort of describe it, rather than up, down. But it is an increase if it's to the right, decrease if it's. And in many ways, I think what we could say about this is probably, it's very similar to what we said in chapter 3 about costs and what can cause a change in the supply curve. It's very analogous to that particular explanation where we said that the number one factor by far is changing costs. And I think you could probably say the same for the aggregate supply function. It's almost always the most important issue is the change in input costs. What does it cost to do business? And right now we are seeing the fact that it's costing businesses a lot to do business. And, and once demand picks up, maybe it won't cost as much. Maybe they'll get workers back, and the labor force will be more back in force. And so they won't be forced to pay the kind of wages, starting wages that they are. We'll see how all this goes. I think we're in for some interesting times in the next year or so at least, okay? Change in input costs. Another one is a change in technology. Now, this is almost always responsible for a rightward shift. And this is the great thing about technology, really. I know there are those who don't always like changes in technology because it does cause disruption, particularly to those who are trying to offer a outdated technology. New changes can come along and disrupt things. We call that creative destruction or disruptive technology. But what it does is it almost always causes a rightward shift. Because think about the reasons why. Who would adopt a technology that doesn't reduce costs and cause you to be able to produce more? Why would you go back to a technology that is less efficient as opposed to more? So think about this. If you had two grocery stores in town, Smith's and Albertsons, and if they were both using the old manual cash registers, and then the first company that came along with the optical scanners would have a natural advantage just through the adoption of technology. Who would want to stand up for a long in line longer to have somebody manually key it in when you can easily swipe yourself in and out through the use of technology, and so you can actually do more with less. And that's a lot of what technology has allowed us to do. And then the other would be changes in government policy. You could say here taxes and regulation are probably the key issue here. If you consider taxes to be a cost of doing business, then it sort of dovetails in with the first point here that as an input, as a cost, even though taxes aren't really an input cost, but they track sometimes more output than anything. Whether it's a sales tax, excise tax, income tax even. But changes in policy would affect what businesses choose to do or don't choose to do, and as a result of that. So, okay, and then I'm almost really very close to being done with this particular segment. I wanted to focus on this idea of change in the aggregate price level, and that is the idea of demand pull inflation versus demand-induced recession and whatnot. So, and I want to talk just a bit about what that's about here, okay? Just a little bit. So when we talk about demand pull inflation, now that we've got the model of aggregate demand, aggregate supply laid out, let's put them together and then talk about how things can change throughout the economy if there's something happening. Well, it's one thing to take these in isolation, but let's put them both together. And we're going to be looking at the short run view here. And so we're going to take aggregate demand here as a downward sloping function, aggregate supply in the short run is being upward sloping like that. And then the junction point between the two of these then is the equilibrium price level in the economy, whatever that is, doesn't matter, an equilibrium GDP. And again, we've already talked about equilibrium before. It doesn't really require a tremendous amount of definition, other than to say it's a point of balance, right? Stable GDP and stable price level is what's happening here, right? So what about a condition in which you've got demand pull inflation, which tends to be the most common form of inflation? I'm going to go ahead and erase this here right now. And we're going to come back a bit to this before we end up probably around week 6, something like that. This idea of demand pull versus cost push. But for right now, I'll do a sort of a quick version of this. So if we start out with some P0, Y0, both equilibrium conditions, and we've got a change in aggregate demand for whatever reason, maybe stimulus, right? Since the stimulus topic is so current in our minds, we've got AD moving to the right with ADY, or AD1. So in other words, it's a rightward shift. Well, what's going to happen? What we're going to do is sort of follow the yellow brick road here. We're going to have a rise in GDP because there's more people with more money and more stimulus. And as a result, we're going to get a higher price level as a result. And there are those who believe that a lot of the stimulus the government's been pouring on, not just the stimulus payments that we're getting arriving in our households, but also things like cuts in taxes, expansions of unemployment benefits and whatnot. All that has also contributed to the rise in the price level. But this would be an example of demand pull inflation. Now, at the same time you're getting a rise in GDP, which tells us then this is a situation that's difficult to get our arms around. In fact, it depends on who you are as to whether or not you think that something should happen. Because the trade-off here is, yeah, you get a little higher prices, but you also get more GDP and more income. This kind of goes back to the situation I described earlier with the state of Israel, where yes, everyone was getting an increase in prices were going up, but everyone was getting an increase, and so GDP was rising. Everyone was more or less happy with it, but you still did have a large increase in the price level over time. And we go back to these problems with inflation, that is, over very long time periods, we have real distortions in values. In particular, if you're committing funds to a very long time period, particularly as a lender, you're not going to get, or even like a landlord, you're going to get less back in cheaper dollars over time, unless there's a way to catch up with that. By the way, the insurance industry has long ago figured out this inflation characteristic by including inflation riders on life insurance policies. Because think about this: who do they really want to sell life insurance to? They tend to get on people who have just gotten married. Usually, single people with no kids are hard to sell life insurance to. I know the president of New York Life had once said that life insurance wasn't bought, it was sold, which kind of tells you a little bit about the sales theory there. So if people who are married, yeah, they begin to think about that. Well, let's say you're married and you're both in your 20s, well, you're probably not going to, either one of you are probably going to pass away for a good 50 years or so. So if you took out a $100,000 life policy, well, what would that be like in 50 years? Well, let's go back 50 years. And I think my dad took out like a $10,000 life insurance policy on my mom. He subsequently bought other policies. But $10,000 wasn't worth very much when she passed away in 2015. So, but $10,000 in the 1960s was probably adequate for the time. Well, obviously, that's an example of a contract losing value. So in order to make up for that, insurance companies came up with what we'll call inflation riders, as they would adjust with the value of the consumer price index usually. But you still have to pay more for that. So again, you were paying more for that. That was not a free service as part of the product. It actually came with a cost. So again, inflation does affect people, even though it might not seem to be the case. So demand pull inflation, but it's difficult because you get this kind of thing going on where you get an increase in GDP, which could translate to all kinds of things like increase in personal income, disposable income, all those kinds of things. Maybe the price level is going up, maybe you care about it, maybe you don't, but demand pull inflation can go on for some time. Now, I think that it's probably safe to say right now that demand pull inflation may not be exactly the future we're seeing in this very short run condition, which, by the way, I didn't really define what the short run was from the long run. And that's because of the fact that there's really no good definition. It's kind of like we know it when we see it, which again is not a very satisfactory explanation. But it's probably going to become clearer once we get into the content, which I believe is chapter 18, where we do some, I think the chapter is called Extending the Analysis of Aggregate Supply or something like that, or additional thoughts on aggregate supply, where we have a transition, and a lot of it had to do with the supply side, sort of figuring out that inflation was here to stay. But in the very short run, though, what about a condition in which we get this going on, where let's say we've got an aggregate supply curve, and we'll call it ASSR 0, short run, right? Zero. Then we've got an aggregate demand curve here. We're going to leave aggregate demand alone, and we're going to shift aggregate supply. So let's say we start out with some equilibrium condition, Y sub 0, P sub 0, star, both of those. And what if we have a shrinkage in aggregate supply for various reasons? And so now we've got a leftward shift in aggregate supply to ASSR 1 in this case. So what do we got going on here? Well, this is a little bit more dicey, isn't it? You've got an increase in the price level because of a restriction in supply. You've also now, unlike demand pull inflation where GDP is rising, here GDP is falling. And this is the example of what's called cost push inflation. Now, why it's not called supply push when this is called demand pull is anyone's guess. I guess it's the whole idea of cost being the driver of supply, really. But remember that big shifter of supply being cost. So this is an inflationary condition. This is a lot of what a lot of people believe is happening in the very short run. And I think that a lot of people in government right now, including the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, and we'll talk a bit about the Fed here for the week 5 content. I think he believes a lot of this right now is temporary, that this leftward shift in supply, this decrease in supply, is really holding the economy back and causing goods to go for higher prices because demand is really there. In fact, if anything, demand may be going in this direction, which is going to push the price level up even further, which is why we don't have like a 4% inflation. We've got like a 6% inflation, right? You could have elements of both demand pull and cost push at the moment, which is something that I don't know that I've seen in my lifetime as an economist. I've been doing this for a while. If this is what started it, maybe demand pull is also contributing to it. And so we have an even higher inflation rate than what we would have otherwise, because the inflation rate is very high relative to where it has been in the last, 30, 40 years, really. And I'm not exaggerating. The inflation rate has been very much muted from where it has, whereas in the 60s and 70s, where that's a lot of what the economic story was. So cost push inflation is due to a restriction in aggregate supply for whatever reason. And a lot of times, when we talk about these leftward shifts, we are talking about supply shocks. And we think of this as being associated with something that's really dramatic and out of the ordinary. And in fact, I think a pandemic would be dramatic and out of the ordinary. It probably would fit that definition. Also, things like war, among all the things that war does, economically, it destroys output and raises prices. In almost every war zone in the world, we've seen massive inflation, almost always. During the Civil War in America, the price level went up 25% per year. A 4-year war, so 25% a year, prices doubled in 4 years. A lot of it having to do with destruction of supply, in addition to no unquestionable demand pull inflation, double whammy there. But war is also hopefully a very unusual sort of phenomenon. So hopefully the short run turns out to be short run, and the demand, even though demand may be elevated at the moment, maybe supply catches up and moves this direction, thereby bringing the price level increases back into line a little bit. Now, there's one thing that we should talk about with regard to inflation in general, particularly when it comes to demand pull inflation. I'm going to go to race to this, and that is the skepticism that some have over price level decreases in general. And that has to do with the case in which prices don't fall. And actually, I don't think I'm going to graph it because I don't think I'm going to cover it too much. But that's the idea that prices don't fall as much as that they don't fall right away. That you can have, even if there's a recession going on, the prices aren't going to come down. Once they are up, then they're not going to come ever back down again. The so-called ratchet effect. And I could graph it for you here, but I think it's probably it's not a huge topic, and it's one that we're probably not going to be worrying about very much at the moment. But it's the idea that prices go up and then they don't come back down. That's one of the fears that is going on at the moment about some of the inflationary tendencies, is that if we do slide into recession in particular, that will have the worst of both worlds. Will have less GDP because of less aggregate demand, but then also prices will stay stuck at their previous levels because prices don't like to come down. This is where some of that content of sticky prices comes in that was talked about in the book in chapter 6. And I prefer to sort of keep some of that to later in the class. This whole idea of stickiness versus unstickiness sort of fits in better there. But it's also called the ratchet effect. If you've ever worked with a ratchet, it's a tool that goes one way, it's locked out, and going the other way. In other words, prices are considered to be downwardly inflexible. They go up, they don't really come down. Now, they might not go up anymore, but they are definitely not coming down. So they move in one direction. And if you think about it, most goods prices, they mostly go in one direction. They mostly go up. Yes, there are some exceptions for goods that are newly introduced. A lot of tech goods will come down in price. That's got more to do with cost of production, though, than it does any kind of demand side issue. And most goods, though, will go up in price. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and end this video here, and then I'm going to pick up with fiscal policy and an introduction to monetary policy. So the sections we have remaining in the course deal with government policy, composed of fiscal and monetary policy. And so to kick off the monetary policy, we'll define a little bit about what the financial system is about. And then we'll get into talking about monetary policy more in the week 6. In week 7, we'll tie it all together by getting into a discussion of theory. Okay, so that's where we're heading next.